Chapter 16 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This recording is in the public domain. An Ordeal. That was the way it came about that little Sate not only, but Susie and Nettie, went to the flower party. They had not expected to do any such thing. The little girls, who were not used to going anywhere, had paid no attention to the announcements on Sunday, and Nettie had heard as one with whom such things had nothing in common. Her treatment in the Sabbath school was not such as to make her long for the companionship of the girls her age, and by this time she knew that her dress at the flower party would be sure to command more attention than was pleasant. So she had planned as a matter of course to stay away. But the little old ladies in their caps and spectacles, springing into active life, put a new face on the matter. Certainly no more astonished young person can be imagined than Nettie Decker was, the morning Miss Sherrill called on her, the one daisy she had begged still carefully preserved, and proposed her plan of partnership in the flower party. "It will add ever so much to the fun," she explained, "besides bringing you a nice little sum for your spending money." Did Miss Sherrill have any idea how far that argument would reach just now? Nettie wondered. "We can dress the little girls in daisies," continued their teacher. "Little Sate will look like a flower herself, with daisies wreathed about her dress and hair." "Little Sate will be afraid, I think," Nettie objected. "She is very timid, and not used to seeing many people." "But with Susie she will not mind, will she? Susie has assurance enough to take her through anything. Oh, I wonder if little Sate would not recite a verse about the daisy grandmothers. I have such a cunning one for her. May I teach her, Mrs. Decker, and see if I can get her to learn it?" Mrs. Decker's consent was very easy to gain. Indeed, it had been freely given in Mrs. Decker's heart before it was asked. For Miss Sherrill had not been in the room 5 minutes before she had said, "Your son, Norman, I believe his name is, has promised to help my brother with the church flowers this evening. My brother says he is an excellent helper. His eye is so true. They had quite a laugh together last week. It seems one of the wreaths was not hung plumb. Your son and my brother had an argument about it, but it was finally left as my brother had placed it, but was out of line several inches. He was obliged to admit that if he had followed Norman's suggestion it would have looked much better." After that it would have been hard for Miss Sherrill to have asked a favor which Mrs. Decker would not grant if she could. She saw through it all. These people were in league with Nettie to try to save her boy. What wasn't she ready to do at their bidding? There was but one thing about which she was positive. The little girls could not go without Nettie. They talked it over in the evening, after Miss Sherrill was gone. Nettie looked distressed. She liked to please Miss Sherrill. She was willing to make many grandmothers. She would help to put the little girls in as dainty attire as possible, but she did not want to go to the flower festival. She planned various ways. Jerry would take them down, or Norm. Perhaps even he could go with them. Surely mother would be willing to have them go with Norm. Miss Sherrill would look after them carefully, and they would come home at 8 o'clock, before they began to grow very sleepy. But no, Mrs. Decker was resolved. She could not let them go unless Nettie would go with them and bring them home. "I let one child run the streets," she said with a heavy sigh, "and I have lived to most wish he had died when he was a baby before I did it. And I said then I would never let another one go out of my sight as long as I had control. I can't go, but I would just as soon they would be with you as with me. And unless you go they can't stir a step, and that's the whole of it." Mrs. Decker was a very determined woman when she set out to be, and Nettie looked the picture of dismay. It did not seem possible to her to go to a flower party, and on the other hand it seemed really dreadful to thwart Miss Sherrill. Jerry sat listening, saying little, but the word he put in now and then was on Mrs. Decker's side. He owned to himself that he never so entirely approved of her as at that moment. He wanted Nettie to go to the flower party. "But I have nothing to wear?" said Nettie, blushing and almost weeping. "Nothing to wear!" repeated Mrs. Decker in honest astonishment. "Why, what do you wear on Sundays, I should like to know? I'm sure you look as neat and nice as any girl I ever saw, in your gingham. I was watching you last Sunday and thinking how pretty it was." "Yes, but, mother, they all wear white at such places, and I cut up my white dress, you know, for the little girls. It was rather short for me, anyway. But I should feel queer in any other color." "Oh, well," said Mrs. Decker in some irritation, "if they go to such places to show their clothes, why, I suppose you must stay at home, if you have none that you want to show. I thought, being it was a church, it didn't matter, so you were neat and clean. But churches are like everything else, it seems, places for show." Jerry looked grave disapproval at Nettie, but she felt injured and could have cried. Was it fair to accuse her of going to church to show her clothes, or of being over particular, when she went every Sunday in a blue and white gingham such as no other girl in her class would wear, even to school? This was not church, it was a party. It was hard that she must be blamed for pride, when she was only too glad to stay at home from it. "I can't go in my blue dress, and that is the whole of it," she said at last, a good deal of decision in her voice. "Very well," said Mrs. Decker, "then we'll say no more about it. As for the little girls going without you, they shan't do it. When I set my foot down, it's down." Jerry instinctively looked down at her foot as she spoke. It was a good sized one, and looked as though it could set firmly on any question on which it was put. His heart began to fail him. The flower party and certain things he hoped to accomplish thereby were fading. He took refuge with Mrs. Smith to hide his disappointment, and also to learn wisdom about this matter of dress. "Do clothes make such a very great difference to girls?" was his first question. "Difference?" said Mrs. Smith, rubbing a little more flour on her hands, and plunging them again into the sticky mass she was kneading. "Yes'm, they seem to think of clothes the first thing, when there is any place to go to. Boys aren't that way. I don't believe a boy knows whether his coat ought to be brown or green. What makes the difference?" Mrs. Smith laughed a little. "Well," she said reflectively, "there is a difference, now that's a fact. I noticed it time and again when I was living with Mrs. Jennison. Dick would go off with whatever he happened to have on, and Florence was always in a flutter as to whether she looked as well as the rest. I've heard folks say that it was the fault of the mothers, because they make such a fuss over the girls' clothes, and keep rigging them up in something bright just to make 'em look pretty, till they succeed in making them think there isn't anything quite so important in life as what they wear on their backs. It's all wrong, I believe. But then, Nettie ain't one of that kind. She hasn't had any mother to perk her up and make her vain. I shouldn't think she would be one to care about clothes much." "She doesn't," said Jerry firmly. "I don't think she would care if other folks didn't. The girls in her class act hatefully to her. They don't speak if they can help it. I suppose it's clothes. I don't know what else. They are always rigged out like hollyhocks or tulips. They make fun of her, I guess, and that isn't very pleasant." "Is that the reason she won't go to the flower show next week?" "Yes'm, that's the reason. All the girls are going to dress in white. I suppose she thinks she will look queerly and be talked about. But I don't understand it. Seems to me if all the boys were going to wear blue coats, and I knew it, I'd just as soon wear my gray one, if gray was respectable." "She ought to have a white dress, now that's a fact," said Mrs. Smith with energy, patting her brown loaf, and tucking it down into the tin in a skillful way. "It isn't much for a girl like her to want. If her father was the kind of man he ought to be, she might have a white dress for best as well as not. I've no patience with him." "Her father hasn't drank a drop this week," said Jerry. "Hasn't? Well, I'm glad of it. But I'm thinking of what he has done, and what he will go and do as likely as not, next week. They might be as forehanded as any folks I know of, if he was what he ought to be. There isn't a better workman in the town. Well, you don't care much about the flower party, I suppose?" "I don't know," said Jerry wearily. When I thought the little girls were going, I had a plan. Sate is such a little thing, she would be sure to be half asleep by 8 o'clock, and I was going to coax Norm to come for her, and we carry her home between us. Norm won't go to a flower party, out and out; but he is good-natured, and was beginning to think a great deal of Sate. Then I thought Mr. Sherrill would speak to him. The more we can get Norm to feeling he belongs in such places, the less he will feel like belonging to the corner groceries and the streets." "I see," said Mrs. Smith admiringly. "Well, I do say I didn't think Nettie was the kind of girl to put a white dress between her chances of helping folks. Sarah Ann thinks she's a real true Christian. But Satan does seem to be into the clothes business from beginning to end." "I don't suppose it is any easier for a Christian to be laughed at and slighted than it is for other people," said Jerry, inclined to resent the idea that Nettie was not showing the right spirit, although in his heart he was disappointed in her for caring so much about the color of her dress. "Well, I don't know about that," said Mrs. Smith, stopping in the act of tucking her bread under the blankets, to look full at Jerry. "Why, they even made fun of the Lord Jesus Christ; dressed him up in purple like a king, and mocked at him. When it comes to remembering that, it would seem as if any common Christian might be almost glad of a chance to be made fun of, just to stand in the same lot with him." This was a new thought to Jerry. He studied it for quite a while in silence. Now it so happened that neither Mrs. Smith nor Jerry remembered certain facts. One was that Mrs. Smith's kitchen window was in a line with Mrs. Decker's bedroom window, where Nettie had gone to sit while she mended Norm's shirt. The other was that a gentle breeze was blowing, which brought their words distinctly to Nettie's ears. At first she had not noticed the talk, busy with her own thoughts; then she heard her name, and paused, needle in hand, to wonder what was being said about her. Then, coming to her senses, she determined to leave the room. But her mother, for convenience, had pushed her ironing table against the bedroom door, and then had gone to the yard in search of chips. Nettie was a prisoner. She tried to push the table by pushing against the door, but the floor was uneven, and the table would not move. Meantime, the conversation going on across the alleyway came distinctly to her. No use to cough, they were too much interested to hear her. By and by she grew so interested as to forget that the words were not intended for her to hear. There were more questions involved in this matter of dress than she had thought about. Her cheeks began to burn a little with the thought that her neighbor had been planning help for Norm, which she was blocking because she had no white dress. This was an astonishment. She had not known she was proud. In fact, she had thought herself very humble, and worthy of commendation because she went Sabbath after Sabbath to the school in the same blue and white dress, not so fresh now by a great deal as when she first came home. When Mrs. Smith reached the sentence which spoke of the Lord Jesus being robed in purple, and crowned with thorns, and mocked, 2 great tears fell on Norm's shirt sleeve. It was a very gentle little girl who moved about the kitchen getting early tea. Mrs. Decker glanced at her from time to time in a bewildered way. The sort of girl with whom she was best acquainted would have slammed things about a little, both because she had not clothes to wear like other children, and because she had been blamed for not wanting to do what was expected of her. But Nettie's face had no trace of anger; her movements were gentleness itself. Her voice when she spoke was low and sweet. "Mother, I will take the little girls if you will let them go." Mrs. Decker drew a relieved sigh. "I'd like them to go because she asked to have them, and I can see plain enough she is trying to get hold of Norm. So is he. That's what helping with the flowers means. And there ain't anything I ain't willing to do to help, only I couldn't let the little girls go without you; they'd be scared to death, and it wouldn't look right. I'm sorry enough you ain't got suitable clothes. If I could help it, you should have as good as the best of them." "Never mind," said Nettie. "I don't think I care anything about the dress now." She was thinking of that crown of thorns. So when Miss Sherrill called, the way was plain, and little Sate ready to be taught anything she would teach her. They went away down to the pond under the clump of trees which formed such a pretty shade, and there Sate's slow sweet voice said over the lines as they were told to her, putting in many questions which the words suggested. "He makes the flowers blow," she repeated with thoughtful face. Then, "What did he make them for?" "I think it was because he loved them, and he likes to give you and me sweet and pleasant things to look at." "Does he love flowers?" "I think so, darling." "And birds? See the birds!" For at that moment two beauties standing on the edge of their nest looked down into the clear water, and seeing themselves reflected in its smoothness, began to talk in low sweet chirps to their shadows. "Oh, yes, he loves the birds, I am sure. Think how many different kinds he has made, and how beautiful they are. Then he has given them sweet voices, and they are thanking him as well as they know how for all his goodness. Listen." Sure enough, one of the little birds hopped back a trifle, balanced himself well on the nest, and, putting up his little throat, trilled a lovely song. "What does he say?" asked Sate, watching him intently. "Oh, I don't know," said Miss Sherrill, with a little laugh. Sate was taxing her powers rather too much. "But God understands, you know, and I am sure the words are very sweet to him." Sate reflected over this for a minute, then went back to the flowers. "What made him put the colors on them? Does he like to see the pretty colors, do you think? Which color does he like just the very bestest of all?" "Oh, you darling! I don't know that either. Perhaps crimson; or no, I think he must like pure white ones a little the best. But he likes little human flowers the best of all; little white flowers with souls. Do you know what I mean, darling? White hearts are given to the little children who try all the time to do right, because they love Jesus and want to please him." "Sate wants to," said the little girl earnestly. "Sate loves Jesus, and she would like to kiss him." "I do not know but you shall, some day. Now shall we take another line of the hymn?" continued her teacher. "I tried to teach her," explained Miss Sherrill to her brother, "but I think, after all, she taught me the most. She is the dearest little thing, and asks the strangest questions. When I look at her grave, sweet face, and hear her slow, sweet voice making wise answers, and asking wise questions, a sort of baby wisdom, you know, I can only repeat over and over the words, 'Of such is the kingdom of heaven.' To day I told her the story of Jesus taking the little children up in his arms and blessing them. She listened with that thoughtful look in her eyes which is so wonderful, then suddenly she held up her pretty arms and said in the most coaxing tones, 'Take little Sate to him, and let him bless her yite away.' Tremaine, I could hardly keep back the tears. Do you think he can be going to call her soon?" "Not necessarily at all. There is no reason why a little child should not live very close to him on earth. I hope that little girl has a great work to do for Christ in this world. She has a very sweet face." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Flower Party. I dare say some of you think Nettie Decker was a very silly girl to care so much because her dress was a blue and white gingham instead of being all white. You have told your friend Katie about the story, and asked her if she didn't think it was real silly to make such an ado over clothes. You have said you were sure you would just as soon wear a blue gingham as not, if it was clean and neat. But now let me venture a hint. I shouldn't be surprised if that was because you never do have to go to places differently dressed from all the others; because if you did, you would know that it was something of a trial. Oh, I don't say it is the hardest thing in the world, or that one is all ready to die as a martyr who does it; but what I do say is, that it takes a little moral courage; and, for one, I am not surprised that Nettie looked very sober about it when the afternoon came. It took her a good while to dress; not that there was so much to be done, but she stopped to think. With her hair in her neck, still unbraided, she pinned a lovely pink rose at her breast just to see how pretty it would look for a minute. Miss Sherrill had left it for her to wear. But she did not intend to wear it because she thought it would not match well with her gingham dress. Just here I don't mind owning that I think her silly, because I believe that sweet flowers go with sweet pure young faces, whether the dress is of gingham or silk. But Nettie looked grave as I said, and wished it was over, and tried to plan for the 100th time how it would all be. The girls, Cecilia Lester and Lorena Barstow and the rest of them, would be out in their elegant toilets, and would look at her so. That Ermina Farley would be there. She had seen her but once, on the first Sunday, and liked her face and her ways a little better than the others, but she had been away since then. Jerry said she was back, however, and Mrs. Smith said they were the richest folks in town, and of course Ermina would be elegantly dressed at the flower party. Well, she did not care. She was willing to have them all dressed beautifully. She was not mean enough to want them to wear gingham dresses, if only they would not make fun of hers. Oh, if she could only stay at home, and help iron and get supper, and fry some potatoes nicely for father, how happy she would be. Then she sighed again, and set about braiding her hair. She meant to go, but she could not help feeling sorry for herself to think it must be done, and she spent a great deal of trouble in trying to plan just how hateful it would all be. How the girls would look, and whisper and giggle, and how her cheeks would burn. Oh, dear! Then she found it was late, and had to make her fingers fly, and to rush about the little woodhouse chamber, which was still her room, in a way which made Sarah Ann say to her mother with a significant nod, "I guess she's woke up and gone at it, poor thing." Yes, she had, and was down in 15 minutes more. Oh, but didn't the little girls look pretty! Nettie forgot her trouble for a few minutes, in admiring them when she had put the last touches to their toilet. Susie was to be in a tableau where she would need a dolly, and Miss Sherrill had furnished one for the occasion. A lovely dolly with real hair and blue eyes, and a bright blue sash to match them. And when Susie got it in her arms, there came such a sweet, softened look over her face that Nettie hardly knew her. The sturdy voice, too, which was so apt to be fierce, softened and took a motherly tone. The dolly was certainly educating Susie. Little Sate looked on, interested, pleased, but without the slightest shade of envy. She wanted no dolly, or if she did, there was a little black-faced, worn rag one reposing at this moment in the trundle bed where little Sate's own head would rest at night, kissed and caressed and petted, and told to be good until mamma came back. This dolly had all of Sate's warm heart. For the rest, the grave little old women in caps and spectacles, which wound about her dress, crept up in bunches on her shoulders, lay in nestling heaps at her breast, filled all Sate's thoughts. She seemed to have become a little old woman herself, so serious and womanly was her face. Nettie took a hand of each, and they went to the flower festival. There was to be a 5 o'clock tea for all the elderly people of the church, and the tables, some of them, were set in Mr. Eastman's grounds, which adjoined the church. When Nettie entered these grounds, she found a company of girls several years younger than herself, helping to decorate the tables with flowers. At least that was their work, but as Nettie appeared at the south gate, a queer little object pushed in at the west side. A child not more than 6 years old, with a clean face and carefully combed hair, but dressed in a plain dark calico, and her pretty pink toes were without shoes or stockings. I am not sure that if a little wolf had suddenly appeared before them, it could have caused more exclamations of astonishment and dismay. "Only look at that child!" "The idea!" "Just to think of such a thing!" were a few of the exclamations with which the air was thick. At last, one bolder than the rest, stepped towards her. "Little girl, where did you come from? What in the world do you want here?" Startled by the many eyes and the sharp tones, the small newcomer hid her face behind an immense bunch of glowing hollyhocks, which she held in her hand, and said not a word. Then the chorus of voices became more eager. "Do look at her hollyhocks! Did ever anybody see such a queer little fright? Girls, I do believe she has come to the party." Then the one who had spoken before tried again. "See here, child, whoever you are, you must go right straight home. This is no place for you. I wonder what your mother was about, if you have one, to let you run away barefooted and looking like a fright." Now the barefooted maiden was thoroughly frightened, and sobbed outright. It was precisely what Nettie Decker needed to give her courage. When she came in at the gate, she had felt like shrinking away from all eyes. Now she darted an indignant glance at the speaker, and moved quickly toward the crying child, Susie and Sate following close behind. "Don't cry, little girl," she said in the gentlest tones, stooping and putting an arm tenderly about the trembling form. "You haven't done anything wrong. Miss Sherrill will be here soon, and she will make it all right." Thus comforted, the tears ceased, and the small newcomer allowed her hand to be taken, while Susie came around to her other side and scowled fiercely, as though to say, "I'll protect this girl myself. Let's see you touch her now." A burst of laughter greeted Nettie as soon as she had time to give heed to it. Others had joined the groups, among them Lorena Barstow and Irene Lewis. "What's all this?" asked Irene. "Oh, nothing," said one. "Only that Decker girl's sister or cousin or something has just arrived from Cork, and come in search of her. Lorena Barstow, did you ever see such a queer looking fright?" "I don't see but they look a good deal alike," said Lorena, tossing her curls. "I'm sure their dresses correspond. Is she a sister?" "Why, no," answered one of the smaller girls. "Those two cunning little things in white are Nettie Decker's sisters. I think they are real sweet." "Oh!" said Lorena, giving them a disagreeable stare. "In white, are they? The unselfish older sister has evidently cut up her nightgowns to make them white dresses for this occasion." "Lorena," said the younger girl, "if I were you I would be ashamed. Mother would not like you to talk in that way." "Well, you see, Miss Nannie, you are not me, therefore you cannot tell what you would be or do; and I want to inform you it is not your business to tell me what mother would like." Imagine Nettie Decker standing quietly, with the barefooted child's small hand closely clasped in hers, listening to all this. There was a pretense of lowered voices, yet every word was distinct to her ears. Her heart beat fast, and she began to feel as though she really was paying quite a high price for the possibility of getting Norm into the church parlor for a few minutes that evening. At that moment, through the main gateway, came Ermina Farley, a colored man with her, bearing a basket full of such wonderful roses that for a minute the group could only exclaim over them. Ermina was in white, but her dress was simply made, and looked as though she might not be afraid to tumble about on the grass in it. Her shoes were thick, and the blue sash she wore, though broad and handsome, had someway a quiet air of fitness for the occasion, which did not seem to belong to most of the others. She watched the disposal of her roses, then gave an inquiring glance about the grounds as she said, "What are you all doing here?" "We are having a tableau," said Lorena Barstow. "Look behind you, and you will see the Misses Bridget and Margaret Mulrooney, who have just arrived from ould Ireland, sure." Most of the thoughtless girls laughed, mistaking this rudeness for wit, but Ermina turned quickly and caught her first glimpse of Nettie's burning face. Then she hastened toward her. "Why, here is little Prudy, after all," she said eagerly. "I coaxed her mother to let her come, but I didn't think she would. Has Miss Sherrill seen her? I think she will be such a cunning Roman flower girl in that tableau, you know. Her face is precisely the shape and style of the little girls we saw in Rome last winter. Poor little girlie, was she frightened? How kind you were to take care of her. She is a real bright little thing. I want to coax her into Sunday school if I can. Let us go and ask Miss Sherrill what she thinks about the flower girl." How fast Ermina Farley could talk! She did not wait for replies. The truth was, Nettie's glowing cheeks and Susie's fierce looks told her the story of trial for somebody else besides the Roman flower girl. She could guess at things which might have been said before she came. She wound her arm familiarly about Nettie's waist as she spoke, and drew her, almost against her will, across the lawn. "My!" said Irene Lewis, "how good we are!" "Birds of a feather flock together," quoted Lorena Barstow. "I think that barefooted child and her protector look alike." "Still," said Irene, "you must remember that Ermina Farley has joined that flock, and her feathers are very different." "Oh, that is only for effect," was the naughty reply, with another toss of the rich curls. Now what was the matter with all these disagreeable young people? Did they really attach so much importance to the clothes they wore as to think no one was respectable who was not dressed like them? Had they really no hearts, so that it made no difference to them how deeply they wounded poor Nettie Decker? I do not think it was quite either of these things. They had been, so far in their lives, unfortunate, in that they had heard a great deal about dress and style until they had done what young people and a few older ones are apt to do, attached too much importance to these things. They were neither old enough nor wise enough to know that it is a mark of a shallow nature to judge of people by the clothes they wear. Then, in regard to ill-natured things said, I tell you truly, that even Lorena Barstow was ashamed of herself. When her younger sister reproved her, the flush which came on her cheek was not all anger, much of it was shame. But she had taught her tongue to say so many disagreeable words, and to pride herself on its independence in saying what she pleased, that the habit asserted itself, and she could not seem to control it. The contrast between her own conduct and Ermina Farley's struck her so sharply and disagreeably it served only to make her worse than before, precisely the effect which follows when people of uncontrolled tempers find themselves rebuked. Halfway down the lawn the party in search of Miss Sherrill met her face to face. Her greeting was warm. "Oh, here is my dear little grandmother. Thank you, Nettie, for coming. I looked to you for a great deal of help. Why, Ermina, what wee mousie have you here?" "She is a little Roman flower girl, Miss Sherrill. They live on Parker Street. Her mother is a nice woman. My mother has her to run the machine. I coaxed her to let Trudie wear her red dress and come barefoot until you would see if she would do for the Roman flower girl. Papa says her face is very Roman in style, and she always makes us think of the flower girls we saw there. I brought my Roman sash to dress her in, if you thought well of it. She is real bright, and will do just as she is told." "It is the very thing," said Miss Sherrill, with a pleased face. "I am so glad you thought of it. And the hollyhocks are just red enough to go in the basket. Did you think of them, too?" "No, ma'am, mamma did. She said the more red flowers we could mass about her, the better for a Roman peasant." "It will be a lovely thing," said Miss Sherrill. Then she stooped and kissed the small brown face, which was now smiling through its tears. "You have found good friends, little one. She is very small to be here alone. Ermina, will you and Nettie take care of her this afternoon, and see that she is happy?" "Yes'm," said Ermina promptly. "Nettie was taking care of her when I came. She was afraid at first, I think." "They were ugly to her," volunteered Susie. "They were just as ugly to her as they could be. They made her cry. If they'd done it to Sate, I would have scratched them and bit them." "Oh," said Miss Sherrill sorrowfully. "How sorry I am to hear it. Then Susie would have been naughty too, and it wouldn't have made the others any better. In fact, it would have made them worse." "I don't care," said Susie, but she did care. She said that, just as you do sometimes, when you mean you care a great deal, and don't want to let anybody know it. For the first time, Susie reflected whether it was a good plan to scratch and bite people who did not, in her judgment, behave well. It had not been a perfect success in her experience, she was willing to admit that; and if it made Miss Sherrill sorry, it was worth thinking about. Well, that afternoon which began so dismally blossomed out into a better time than Nettie had imagined it possible for her to have. To be sure, those particular girls who had been the cause of her sorrow would have nothing to do with her, and whispered and sent disdainful glances her way when they had an opportunity; but Nettie went in their direction as little as possible, and when she did was in such a hurry that she sometimes forgot all about them. Miss Sherrill, who was chairman of the committee of entertainment, kept her as busy as a bee the entire afternoon, running hither and thither, carrying messages to this one, and pins to that one, setting this vase of flowers at one end and that lovely basket at another, and a great deal of the time standing right beside Miss Sherrill herself, handing her, at call, just what she needed when she dressed the girls with their special flowers. She could hear the bright pleasant talk which passed between Miss Sherrill and the other young ladies. She was often appealed to with a pleasant word. Her own teacher smiled on her more than once, and said she was the handiest little body who had ever helped them; and all the time that lovely Ermina Farley with her beautiful hair, and her pretty ways, and her sweet low voice, was near at hand, joining in everything which she had to do. To be sure she heard, in one of her rapid scampers across the lawn, this question asked in a loud tone by Lorena Barstow: "I wonder how much they pay that girl for running errands? Maybe she will earn enough to get herself a new white nightgown to wear to parties." But at that particular minute Ermina Farley, running from another direction on an errand precisely like her own, bumped up against her with such force that their noses ached. Then both stopped to laugh merrily, and someway, what with the bump and the laughter, Nettie forgot to cry, when she had a chance, over the unkind words. Then, later in the afternoon, came Jerry; and in less than 5 minutes he joined their group, and made himself so useful that when Mr. Sherrill came presently for boys to go with him to the chapel to arrange the tables, Miss Sherrill said in low tones, "Don't take Jerry, please; we need him here." Nettie heard it, and beamed her satisfaction. Also she heard Irene Lewis say, "Now they've taken that Irish boy into their crowd. Shouldn't you think Ermina Farley would be ashamed?" Then Nettie's face fairly paled. It is one thing to be insulted yourself; it is another to stand quietly by and see your friends insulted. She was almost ready to appeal to Miss Sherrill for protection from tongues; but Jerry heard the same remark and laughed, not in a forced way, but actually as though it was very amusing to him; and almost immediately he called out something to Ermina, using an unmistakable Irish brogue. What was the use in trying to protect a boy who was so indifferent as that? Chapter 17 of Little Fishers and Their Nets, by Pansy. A Satisfactory Evening. The little old grandmothers with their queer caps were perhaps the feature of the evening. Everybody wanted a bouquet of them. In fact, long before 8 o'clock, Jerry had been hurried away for a fresh supply, and Nettie had been established behind a curtain to "make more grandmothers." In her excitement she made them even prettier than before, and sweet, grave little Sate had no trouble in selling every one. The pretty Roman flower girl was so much admired that her father, a fine looking young mechanic who came after her bringing red stockings and neat shoes, carried her off at last in triumph on his shoulder, saying he was afraid her head would be turned with so much praise, but thanking everybody with bright smiling eyes for giving his little girl such a pleasant afternoon. "She isn't Irish after all," said Irene Lewis, watching them. "And Mr. Sherrill shook hands with him as familiarly as though he was an old friend. I wish we hadn't made such simpletons of ourselves. Lorena Barstow, what did you want to go and say that she was an Irish girl for?" "I didn't say any such thing," said Lorena in a shrill voice. And then these two who had been friends in ill humor all the afternoon quarreled, and went home more unhappy than before. And still I tell you they were not the worst girls in the world, and were very much ashamed of themselves. Before 8 o'clock Norm came. To be sure, he stoutly refused at first to step beyond the doorway, and ordered Nettie in a somewhat surly tone to "bring that young one out," if she wanted her carried home. That, of course, was the little grandmother. But her eyes looked as though she had not thought of being sleepy, and the ladies were not ready to let her go. Then the minister, who seemed to understand things without having them explained, said, "Where is Decker? We'll make it all right. Come, little grandmother, let us go and see about it." So he took Sate on his shoulder and made his way through the crowd; and Nettie, who watched anxiously, presently saw Norm coming back with them, not looking surly at all. His clothes had been brushed, and he had on a clean collar, and his hair was combed, quite as though he had meant to come in after all. Soon after Norm's coming, something happened which gave Nettie a glimpse of her brother in a new light. Young Ernest Belmont was there with his violin. During the afternoon Nettie had heard whispers of what a lovely player he was, and at last saw with delight that a space was being cleared for him to play. Crowds of people gathered about the platform to listen, but among them all Norm's face was marked; at least it was to Nettie. She had never seen him look like that. He seemed to forget the crowds and the lights and everything but the sounds which came from that violin. He stood perfectly still, his eyes never once turning from their earnest gaze of the fingers which were producing such wonderful tones. Nettie, looking and wondering, almost forgot the music in her astonishment that her brother should be so absorbed. Jerry with some difficulty elbowed his way towards her, his face beaming, and said, "Isn't it splendid?" For answer she said, "Look at Norm," and Jerry looked. "That's so," he said at last, heartily, speaking as though he was answering a remark from somebody. "Norm is a musician. Did you know he liked it so much?" "I didn't know anything about it," Nettie said, hardly able to keep back the tears, though she did not understand why her eyes should fill. But there was such a look of intense enjoyment in Norm's face, mingled with such a wistful longing for something, as made the tears start in spite of her. "I didn't know he liked anything so much as that." "He likes that," said Jerry heartily, "and I am glad." "I don't know. What makes you glad? I am almost sorry; because he may never have a chance to hear it again." "He must make his chances. He is going to be a man. I'm glad, because it gives us a hint as to what his tastes are. Don't you see?" "Why, yes," said Nettie. "I see he likes it; but what is the use in knowing people's tastes if you can't possibly do anything for them?" "There's no such thing as it not being possible to do most anything," Jerry said good humoredly. "Maybe we will some of us own a violin some day, and Norm will play for us. Who knows? Stranger things than that have happened." But this thing looked to Nettie so improbable that she merely laughed. The music suddenly ceased, and Norm came back from dreamland and looked about him, and blushed, and felt awkward. He saw the people now, and the lights, and the flowers. He remembered his hands, and did not know what to do with them; and his feet felt too large for the space they must occupy. Jerry plunged through the crowd and stood beside him. "How did you like it?" he asked, and Norm cleared his voice before replying. He could not understand why his throat should feel so husky. "I like a fiddle," he said. "There is a fellow comes to the corner grocery down there by Crossman's and plays sometimes. I always go down there when I hear of it." If Jerry could have caught Nettie's eye just then he would have made a significant gesture. The store by Crossman's made tobacco and liquor its chief trade. So a fiddle was one of the things used to draw the boys into it. "Is a fiddle the only kind of music you like?" Jerry had been accustomed to calling it a violin, but the instinct of true politeness which was marked in him made him say fiddle just now as Norm had done. "Oh, I like anything that whistles a tune," said Norm. "I've gone a rod out of my way to hear a Jew's harp many a time. Even an old hand organ sounds nice to me. I don't know why, but I never hear one without stopping and listening as long as I can." He laughed a little as though ashamed of the taste, and looked at Jerry suspiciously; but there was not the slightest hint of a smile on the boy's face, only hearty interest and approval. "I like music too, almost any sort; but I don't believe I like it as well as you. Your face looked while you were listening as though you could make some yourself if you tried." The smile went out quickly from Norm's face, and Jerry thought he heard a little sigh with the reply, "I never had a chance to try, and never expect to have." "Well, now, I should like to know why not? I never could understand why a boy with brains and hands and feet shouldn't have a try at almost anything which was worth trying, some time in his life." It was not Jerry who said this, but the minister who had come up in time to hear the last words from both sides. He stopped before Norm, smiling as he spoke. "Try the music, my friend, by all means, if you like it. It is a noble taste worth cultivating." Norm looked sullen. "It's easy to talk," he said severely, "but when a fellow has to work like a dog to get enough to eat and wear, to keep him from starving or freezing, I'd like to see him get a chance to try at music, or anything else of that kind." "So should I. He is the very fellow who ought to have the chance; and more than that, in 9 cases out of 10 he is the fellow who gets it. A boy who is willing and able to work is pretty sure in this country to have opportunity to gratify his tastes in the end. He may have to wait a while, but that only sharpens the appetite of a genuine taste. If it is a worthy taste, as music certainly is, it will grow with his growth, and will help him to plan and save and contrive, until one of these days he will show you. By the way, you would like organ music, I fancy; the sort which is sometimes played on parlor organs. If you will come to the parsonage to-morrow night at 8 o'clock, I think I can promise you something which you will enjoy. My sister is going to try some new music for a few friends at that time. Suppose you come and pick out your favorite?" All Jerry's satisfaction and interest shone in his face. To-morrow night at 8 o'clock! All day he had been trying to arrange something which would keep Norm at that hour away from the aforesaid corner grocery, where he happened to know some doubtful plans were to be arranged for future mischief, by the set who gathered there. If only Norm would go to the parsonage, it would be the very thing. But Norm flushed and hesitated. "Bring a friend with you," said the minister. "Bring Jerry here. You like music, don't you, Jerry?" "Yes, sir," said Jerry promptly. "I like music very much, and would like to go if Norm is willing." "Bring Jerry with you." That sentence had a pleasant sound. Up to this moment it was the younger boy who had patronized the elder. Norm called him "the little chap," but for all that looked up to him with a curious sort of respect such as he felt for none of the "fellows" who were his daily companions. The idea of bringing him to a place of entertainment had its charms. "May I expect you?" asked the minister, reading his thoughts almost as plainly as though they had been printed on his face, and judging that this was the time to press an acceptance. "Why, yes," said Norm, "I suppose so." One of these days Norman Decker will not think of accepting an invitation with such words, but his intentions are good now, and the minister thanks him as though he had received a favor, and departs well pleased. And now it is really growing late, and little Sate must be carried home. It was an evening to remember. They talked it over by inches the next morning. Nettie finishing the breakfast dishes, and Jerry sitting on the doorstep fashioning a bracket for the kitchen lamp. Nettie talked much about Ermina Farley. "She is just as lovely and sweet as she can be. It was beautiful in her to come over to me as she did when she came into that yard. Part of it was for little Trudy's sake, and a great deal of it was for my sake. I saw it at the time. I saw it plainer all the afternoon. She didn't have a chance to feel alone once, and she didn't stay near me as though she felt like she ought to, but didn't want to, either. She just took hold and helped to do everything Miss Sherrill gave me to do, and was as bright and sweet as she could be. I never shall forget it of her. But for all that," she said as she wrung out her dishcloth with an energy which the small white rag hardly needed, "I know it was pretty hard for her to do it, and I shall not give her a chance to do it again." "I want to know what there was hard about it," said Jerry, looking up in astonishment. "I thought Ermina Farley looked to be having as good a time as anybody there." "Oh, well now, I know you are not a girl, boys are different from girls. They are not so kind of mean. At least, some of them are not," she added quickly, having at that moment a vivid recollection of some mean things which she had endured from boys. "Really, I don't think they are," she said after a moment's thoughtful pause, and replying to the quizzical look on his face. "They don't think about dresses and hats and gloves, and all those sorts of things as girls do, and they don't say such hateful things. Oh, I know there is a great difference. And I know just how Ermina Farley will be talked about because she went with me and stood up for me so. And I think it will be very hard for her. I used to think so about you, but you are real different from girls." "It amounts to about this," said Jerry, whittling gravely. "Good boys are different from bad girls, and bad boys are different from good girls." Nettie laughed merrily. "No," she said, "I do know what I'm talking about, though you don't think so. I know real splendid girls who couldn't have done as Ermina Farley did yesterday, and as you do all the time. And what I say is, I don't mean to put myself where she will have to do it much. I don't want to go to their parties. I don't expect a chance to go, but if I had it, I wouldn't go; and just for her sake, I don't mean to be always around her to have her take care of me as she did yesterday. I have something else to do." Said Jerry, "Where do you think Norm is to take me this evening?" "Norm going to take you!" Great wonderment in the tone. "Why, where could he take you? I don't know, I am sure." "He is to take me to the parsonage at 8 o'clock to hear some wonderful music on the organ. He has been invited, and has had permission to bring me with him if he wants to. Don't you talk about not putting yourself where other people will have to take care of you. I advise you to cultivate the acquaintance of your brother. It isn't everybody who gets invited to the parsonage to hear such music as Miss Sherrill can make." The dishcloth was hung away now, and every bit of work was done. Nettie stood looking at the whittling boy in the doorway for a minute in blank astonishment, then she clasped her hands and said, "Oh, Jerry, did they do it? Aren't they the very splendidest people you ever knew in your life?" "They are pretty good," said Jerry. "That's a fact. They are most as good as my father. I'll tell you what it is, if you knew my father you would know a man who would be worth remembering. I had a letter from him last night, and he sent a message to my friend Nettie." "What?" said Nettie, her eyes very bright. "It is that you are to take good care of his boy, for in his opinion the boy was worth taking care of. On the strength of that, I want you to come out and look at Mother Speckle. She is in a very important frame of mind, and has been scolding her children all the morning. I don't know what is the trouble. There are 2 of her daughters who seem to have gone astray in some way; at least she is very much displeased with them. Twice she has boxed Fluffy's ears, and once she pulled a feather out of poor Buff. See how forlorn she seems." By this time they were making their way to the little house where the hen lived, Nettie agreeing to go for a very few minutes, declaring that if Norm was going out every evening there was work to do. He would need a clean collar, and she must do it up; for mother had gone out to iron for the day. "Mother is so grateful to Mrs. Smith for getting her a chance to work," she said, as they paused before the 2 disgraced chickens. "She says she would never have thought of it if it had not been for her. You know she always used to sew. Why, how funny these chickens look! Only see, Jerry, they are studying that eggshell as though they thought they could make one. Now don't they look exactly as though they were planning something?" "They are," said Jerry. "They are planning going to housekeeping, I believe. You see they have quarreled with their mother. They consider that they have been unjustly punished, and I am in sympathy with them, and they believe they could make a house to live in out of that eggshell, if they could only think of a way to stick it together again. I wish we could build a house out of eggshells, or even one room, and we'd have one before the month was over." "Why?" said Nettie, stooping down to see why Buff kept her foot under her. "Do you want a room, Jerry?" "Somewhat," said Jerry. "At least I see a number of things we could do if we had a room, which I don't know how to do without one. Come over here, Nettie, and sit down. Leave those chickens to sulk it out, and let us talk a little. I have a plan so large that there is no place to put it." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ready to try. "You see," said Jerry, as Nettie came, protesting as she walked that she could stay but a few minutes, because there was Norm's collar, and she had 4 nice apples out of which she was going to make some splendid apple dumplings for dinner, "you see, we must contrive something to keep a young fellow like Norm busy, if we are going to hold him after he is caught. It doesn't do to catch a fish and leave him on the edge of the bank, near enough to flounce back into the water. Norm ought to be set to work to help among the plans, and kept so busy he wouldn't have time to get tired of them." "But how could that be done?" Nettie said in wondering tones, which nevertheless had a note of admiration in them. Jerry went so deeply into things it almost took her breath away to follow him. "Just so, that's the problem which ought to be thought out. I can think of things enough, but the room and the tools to begin with are the trouble." "What have you thought of? What would you do if you could?" "Oh, my!" said Jerry with a little laugh. "Don't ask me that question, or your folks will have no apple dumplings to-day. I don't believe there is any end to the things which I would do if I could. But the first beginnings of them are like this. Suppose we had a few dollars capital, and a room." "You might as well suppose we had a palace and $1,000,000, said Nettie with a long drawn sigh. "No, because I don't expect either of those things. But I do mean to have a room and a few dollars in capital for this thing some day. Only, you see, I don't want to wait for them." "Well, go on. What then?" "Why, then, we would start an eating house, you and I, on a little bit of a scale, you know. We would have bread with some kind of meat between, and coffee, in cold weather, and lemonade in hot, and a few apples, and now and then some nuts, and a good deal of gingerbread, soft like what Auntie Smith makes, and some ginger snaps like those Mrs. Dix sent us from the country, and, well, you know the names of things better than I do. Real good things, I mean, but which don't cost much. Such as you and Sarah Ann and a good many bright girls learn how to make, without using a great deal of money. These things are all rather cheap, which I have mentioned, because we have them at our house quite often, and the Smiths are poor, you know. But they are made so nice that they are just capital. Well, I would have them for sale, just as cheap as could possibly be afforded, a great deal cheaper than beer or cigars, and I would have the room bright and cheery, warm in winter and as cool as I could make it in summer. Then I would have slips of paper scattered about the town, inviting young folks to come in and get a lunch. Then when they came, I would have picture papers if I could, for them to look at, and games to play, real nice jolly games, and some kind of music going on now and then. I'd run opposition to that old grocery around the corner from Crossman's, with its fiddle and its whiskey. That's the beginning of what I would do, just what I told you about that first night we talked it over. The fellows, lots of them, have nowhere to go. It keeps growing in my mind, the need for doing something of the sort. I never pass that mean grocery without thinking of it." You should have seen Nettie's eyes. The little touch of discouragement was gone out of them, and they were full of intense thought. "I can see," she said at last, "just how splendid it might grow to be. But what did you mean about Norm? There isn't any work for him in such a plan; at least, I mean, not until he was interested to help for the sake of others." "Yes, there is; plenty of business for him. Don't you see? I would have this room open evenings, after the work was done, and I would have Norm head manager. He would wait on customers and keep accounts. When the thing got going he would be as busy as a bee; and he is just the sort of fellow to do that kind of thing well, and like it too," he added. "Oh, Jerry!" said Nettie, and her hands were clasped so closely that the blood flowed back into her wrists. "Was there ever a nicer thought than that in the world? I know it would succeed, and Norm would like it so much. Norm likes to do things for others, if he only had the chance." "I know it, and he likes to do things in a business way, and keep everything straight. Oh, he would be just the one. If we only had a room, there is nothing to hinder our beginning in a very small way. Those chickens are growing as fast as they can, and by Thanksgiving there will be a couple of them ready to broil. Then the little old grandmothers did so well." "I know it. Who would have supposed almost $4 could be made out of some daisy grandmothers? Miss Sherrill gave me $1.95, which she said was just half of what they had earned. I do think it was so nice in her to give us that chance. She couldn't have known how much we wanted the money. Jerry, why couldn't we begin just with that? It would start us, and then if the things sold, why, the money from them would keep us started until we found a way to earn more. Why can't we?" "Room," said Jerry, with commendable brevity. "Why, we have a room. There's the front one that we just put in such nice order. Why not? It is large enough for now, and maybe when our business grew we could get another one somehow." Jerry stopped fitting the toe of his boot into a hole which he had made in the ground, and looked at the eager young woman of business before him. "Do you mean your mother would let us have the room, and the chance in the kitchen, to go into such business?" "Mother would do anything," said Nettie emphatically, "anything in the world which might possibly keep Norm in the house evenings. You don't know how dreadfully she feels about Norm. She thinks father—" and there Nettie stopped. How could a daughter put it into words that her mother was afraid her father would lead his son astray? "I know," said Jerry. "See here, Nettie, what is the matter with your father? I never saw him look so still, and—well, queer in some way. Mr. Smith says he doesn't think he is drinking a drop, but he looks unlike himself somehow, and I can't decide how." "I don't know," said Nettie, in a low voice. "We don't know what to think of him. He hasn't been so long without drinking, mother says, in 4 years; but he doesn't act right, or I mean natural. He isn't cross, as drinking beer makes him, but he isn't pleasant, as he was for a day or two. He is real sober, hardly speaks at all, nor notices the things I make. And I try just as hard to please him. He eats everything, but he does it as though he didn't know he was eating. Mother thinks he is in some trouble, but she can't tell what. He can't be afraid of losing his place, because mother says he was threatened that 2 or 3 times when he was drinking so hard, and he didn't seem to mind it at all. And why should he be discharged now, when he works hard every day? Last Saturday night he brought home more money than he has in years. Mother cried when she saw what there was, but she had debts to pay, so we didn't get much start out of it after all. Then we spend a good deal in coffee. We have it 3 times a day, hot and strong. I can see father seems to need it; and I have heard that it helped men who were trying not to drink. When I told mother that, she said he should have it if she had to beg for it on her knees. But I don't know what is the matter with father now. Sometimes mother is afraid there is a disease coming on him, such as men have who drink. She says he doesn't sleep very well nights, and he groans some when he is asleep. Mother tries hard," said Nettie, in a closing burst of confidence, "and she does have such a hard time. If we could only save Norm for her." "I'll tell you who your mother looks like, or would look like if she were dressed up, you know. Did you ever see Mrs. Burt?" "The woman who lives in the cottage where the vines climb all around the front, and who has birds and a baby? I saw her yesterday. You don't think mother looks like her?" "She would," said Jerry positively, "if she had on a pink and white dress and a white fold about her neck. I passed there last night, while Mrs. Burt was sitting out by that window garden of hers, with her baby in her arms. Mr. Burt sat on one of the steps, and they were talking and laughing together. I could not help noticing how much like your mother she looked when she turned her side face. Oh, she is younger, of course; she looks almost as though she might be your mother's daughter. I was thinking what fun it would be if she were, and we could go and visit her, and get her to help us about all sorts of things. Mr. Burt knows how to do every kind of work about building a house or fixing up a room." "He is a nice man, isn't he?" "Why, yes, nice enough. He is steady and works hard. Mr. Smith thinks he is quite a pattern; he has bought that little house where he lives, and fixed it all up with vines and things; but I should like him better if he didn't puff tobacco smoke into his wife's face when he talked with her. He doesn't seem to be so good a workman as your father, nor to know so much in 100 ways. I think your father is a very nice looking man when he is dressed up. He looks smart, and he is smart. Mr. Smith says there isn't a man in town who can do the sort of work that he can at the shop, and that he could get very high wages and be promoted and all that, if—" Jerry stopped suddenly, and Nettie finished the sentence with a sigh. She too had passed the Burt cottage, and admired its beauty and neatness. To think that Mr. Burt owned it, and was a younger man by 15 years at least than her father, and was not so good a workman. Then see how well he dressed his wife, and little Bobby Burt looked as neat and pretty in Sunday school as the best of them. It was very hard that there must be such a difference in homes. If she could only live in a house like the Burt cottage, and have things nice about her as they did, and have her father and mother sit together and talk, as Mr. and Mrs. Burt did, she should be perfectly happy, Nettie told herself. Then she sprang up from the log and declared that she must not waste another minute of time; but that Jerry's plan was the best one she had ever heard, and she believed they could begin it. With this thought still in mind, after the dinner dishes were carefully cleared away, and her mother, returned from the day's ironing, had been treated to a piece of the apple dumpling warmed over for her, and had said it was as nice a bit as she ever tasted, Nettie began on the subject which had been in her thoughts all day. "What would you think of us young folks going into business?" "Going into business!" "Yes'm, Jerry and Norm and me. Jerry has a plan. He has been telling me about it this morning. It is nice if we can only carry it out, and I shouldn't wonder if we could; that is, if you think well of it." "I begin to think there isn't much that you and Jerry can't do with Norm, or with anybody else, if you try; and you both appear to be ready to try to do all you can for everybody." Mrs. Decker's tone was so hearty and pleased that you would not have known her for the same woman who looked forward dismally but a few weeks ago to Nettie's homecoming. Her heart had so warmed to the girl in her efforts for father and brother, that she was almost ready to agree to anything which she could have to propose. So Nettie, well pleased with this beginning, unfolded with great clearness and detail Jerry's wonderful plan for not only catching Norm, but setting him up in business. Mrs. Decker listened, and questioned, and cross-questioned, sewing swiftly the while on Norm's jacket which had been torn, and which was being skillfully darned in view of the evening to be spent at the parsonage. "Well," she said at last, "it looks wild to me, I own. I should as soon try to fly as of making anything like that work in this town. But then, you've made things work, you two, that I'd no notion could be done, and between you, you seem to kind of bewitch Norm. He's done things for you that I would no sooner have thought of asking of him than I would have asked him to fly up to the moon; and this may be another of them. Anyhow, if you've a mind to try it, I won't be the one to stop you. I've been that scared for Norm that I'm ready for anything. Oh, the room, of course you may use it. If you wanted to have a circus in there, I think I'd agree, wild animals and all. I've had worse than wild animals in my day. No, your father won't object. He thinks what you do is about right, I guess. And for the matter of that, he doesn't object to anything nowadays. I don't know what to make of him." The sentence ended with a long-drawn, troubled sigh. Just what this strange change in her husband meant, Mrs. Decker could not decide, and each theory which she started in her mind about it looked worse than the last. Norm's collar was ready for him, so was his jacket. He was somewhat surly. The truth was, he had received what he called a bid to the merrymaking which was to take place in the back room of the grocery around the corner from Crossman's, and he was a good deal tried to think he had cut himself off by what he called a spoony promise from enjoying the evening there. At the same time, there was a certain sense of largeness in saying he could not come because he had received an invitation elsewhere, which gave him a momentary pleasure. To be sure, the boys coaxed until they had discovered the place of his engagement, and joked him the rest of the time until he was half inclined to wish he had never heard of the parsonage. But for all that, a certain something in Norman which marked him as different from some boys, held him to his word when it was past, and he had no thought of breaking from his engagement. It was an evening such as Norman had reason to remember. For the first time in his life he sat in a pleasantly furnished home, among ladies and gentlemen, and heard himself spoken to as one who "belonged." 3 ladies were there from the city, and 2 gentlemen whom Norm had never seen before, all friends of the Sherrills come out to spend a day with them. They were not only unlike any people whom he had ever seen before, but, if he had known it, unlike a great many ladies and gentlemen, in that their chief aim in life was to be found in their master's service, and a boy about whom they knew nothing, save that he was poor, and surrounded by temptations, and Satan desired to have him, was in their eyes so much stray material which they were bound to bring back to the rightful owner if they could. To this end they talked to Norman, not in the form of a lecture, but with bright, winning words, on topics which he could understand not only, but actually on certain topics about which he knew more than they. For instance, there was a cave about 2 miles from the town, of which they had heard but never seen, and Norm had explored every crevice in it many a time. He knew on which side of the river it was located, whether the entrance was from the east or the south, just how far one could walk through it, just how far one could creep in it, after walking had become impossible, and a dozen other things which it had not occurred to him were of interest to anybody else. In fact, Norm discovered in the course of the hour that there was such a thing as conversation. Not that he made use of that word in thinking it over. His thoughts, if they could have been seen, would have been something like this: "These are swell folks, but I can understand what they say, and they seem to understand what I say, and don't stare as though I was a wild animal escaped from the woods. I wonder what makes the difference between them and other folks." But when the music began! I have no words to describe to you what it was to Norm to sit close to an organ and hear its softest notes, and feel the thrill of its heavy bass tones, and be appealed to occasionally as to whether he liked this or that the best, and to have a piece sung because the player thought it would please him. She selected it that morning, she told him, with this thought in view. "Decker, you ought to learn to play," said one of the guests who had watched him through the last piece. "You look music, right out of your eyes. Miss Sherrill, here is a pupil for you who might do you credit. Have you ever had any instrument, Decker?" Then Norm came back to everyday life, and flushed and stammered, no, he hadn't, and was not likely to; and wondered what they would think if they were to see the corner grocery where he spent most of his leisure time. The questioner laughed pleasantly. "Oh, I'm not so sure of that. I have a friend who plays the violin in a way to bring tears to people's eyes, and he never touched one until he was 30 years old, hadn't time until then. He was an apprentice, and had his trade to master, and himself to get well started in it before he had time for music. but when he came to leisure he made music a delight to himself and to others. "A great deal can be done with leisure time," said another of the guests. "Mr. Sherrill, you remember Myers, your college classmate? He did not learn to read, you know, until he was 17." "What?" said Norm, astonished out of his diffidence. "Didn't know how to read?" "No," repeated the gentleman, "not until he was 17. He had a hard childhood, was kicked about in the world, with no leisure and no help, had to work evenings as well as days, but when he was 17 he fell into kinder hands, and had a couple of hours each evening all to himself, and he mastered reading not only, but all the common studies, and graduated from college with honor when he was 26." Now Norm had all his evenings to lounge about in, and had not known what to do with them, and he could read quite well. Chapter 20 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. The Way Made Plain. It was a beautiful Sabbath afternoon, just warm enough to make people feel still and pleasant. The soft summer sunshine lay smiling on all the world, and the soft summer breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and stole gently in at open windows. In the front room of the Deckers the family was gathered, all save Mr. Decker. He could be heard in his bedroom, stepping about occasionally, and great was his wife's fear lest he was preparing to go downtown and put himself in the place of temptation at his old lounging place. Sunday could not be said to be a day of rest to Mrs. Decker. It had been the day of her greatest trials, so far. Norm was in his clean shirt and collar, which had been done up again by Nettie's careful hands, and which shone beautifully. He was also in his shirt sleeves. That the mother was glad to see. He was not going out just yet, anyway. Mrs. Decker had honored the day with a clean calico dress, and had shyly and with an almost shamefaced air pinned into it a little cambric ruffle which Nettie had presented her, with the remark that it was just like the one Mrs. Burt wore, and that Jerry said she looked like Mrs. Burt a little, only he thought she was the best looking of the two. Mrs. Decker had laughed, and then sighed, and said it made dreadful little difference to her how she looked. But the sigh meant that the days were not so very far distant when Mr. Decker used to tell her she was a handsome woman, and she used to smile over it and call him a foolish man without any taste, but nevertheless used to like it very much, and make herself look as well as she could for his sake. She hadn't done it lately, but whose fault was that, she would like to know? However, she pinned the ruffle in, and whether Mr. Decker noticed it or not, she certainly looked wonderfully better. Norm noticed it, but of course he would not have said so for the world. Nettie, in her blue and white gingham, which had been washed and ironed since the flower party, and which had faded a little and shrunken a little, still looked neat and trim, and had the little girls one on either side of her, telling them a story in low tones, not so low but that the words floated over to the window, where Norm was pretending not to listen. "And so," said the voice, "Daniel let himself be put into a den of dreadful fierce lions, rather than give up praying." "Did they frow him in?" This question from little Sate, horror in every letter of the words. "Yes, they did, and shut the door tight." "I wouldn't have been," said fierce Susie. "I would have bitten and scratched and kicked just awful." "Why didn't Daniel shut up the window just as tight, and not let anybody know it when he said his prayers?" "Oh, little Sate, how many older and wiser ones than you have tried to slip around conscience corners in some such way." "I don't know all the reasons," said Nettie, after a thoughtful pause, "but I suppose one was, because he wouldn't act in a way to make people believe he had given up praying. He wanted to show them that he meant to pray, whether they forbade it or not." "Go on," said Susie, sharply. "I want to know how he felt when the lions bit him." "They didn't bite him. God wouldn't let them touch him. They crouched down and kept as still all night, and in the morning when the king came to look, there was Daniel, safe." "Oh, my!" said Sate, drawing a long, quivering sigh of relief. "Wasn't that just splendid?" "How do you know it is true?" said skeptical Susie, looking as though she was prepared not to believe anything. "I know it because God said it, Susie. He put it in the Bible." "I didn't ever hear him say it," said Susie with a frown. A laugh from Norm at that moment gave Nettie her first knowledge of him as a listener. Her cheeks grew red, and she would have liked to slip away into a more quiet corner, but Sate was in haste to hear just what the king said, and what Daniel said, and all about it, and the story went on steadily, Daniel's character for true bravery shining out all the more strongly perhaps because Nettie suspected herself of being a coward, and not liking Norm to laugh at her Bible stories. As for Norm, he knew he was a coward. He knew he had done in his life dozens of things to make his mother cry; not because he was so anxious to do them, nor because he feared a den of lions if he refused, but simply because some of the fellows would laugh at him if he did. That Sabbath day had been a memorable one to the Decker family in some respects; at least to part of it. Nettie had taken the little girls with her to Sabbath school, and then to church. Mrs. Smith had given her a cordial invitation to sit in their seat, but it was not a very large seat, and when Job and his wife and Sarah Ann and Jerry were all there, as they were apt to be, there was just room for Nettie without the little girls; so she went with them to the seat directly under the choir gallery, where very few sat. It was comfortable enough; she could see the minister distinctly, and though she had to stretch out her neck to see the choir, she could hear their sweet voices; and surely that was enough. All went smoothly until the sermon was concluded. Sate sat quite still, and if she did not listen to the sermon, listened to her own thoughts and troubled no one. But when the anthem began, Sate roused herself, that wonderful voice which seemed to fill every corner of the church. She knew the voice; it belonged to her dear teacher. She stretched out her little neck, and could catch a glimpse of her, standing alone, the rest of the choir sitting back out of sight. And what was that she was saying, over and over? "Come unto me, unto me, unto me." The words were repeated in the softest of cadences. "All ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Sate did not understand those words, certainly her little feet were not weary, but there was a sweetness about the word rest as it floated out on the still air, which made her seem to want to go, she knew not whither. Then came the refrain, "Come unto me, unto me," swelling and rolling until it filled all the aisles, and dying away at last in the tenderest of pleading sounds. Sate's heart beat fast, and the color came and went on her baby face in a way which would have startled Nettie if she had not been too intent on her own exquisite delight in the music to remember the motionless little girl at her left. "Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, called the sweet voice, and Sate, understanding the last of it, felt that she wanted to learn, and of that one above all others. "For I am meek and lowly of heart." She did not know what the words meant, but she was drawn, drawn. Then, listening, breathless, half resolved, came again that wondrous pleading, "Come unto me, unto me, unto me." Softly the little feet slid down to the carpeted floor, softly they stepped on the green and gray mosses which gave back no sound. Softly they moved down the aisle, as though they had carried a spirit with them, and when Nettie, hearing no sound, yet turned suddenly as people will, to look after her charge, little Sate was gone. Where? Nettie did not know, could not conjecture. No sight of her in the aisle, not under the seat, not in the great church anywhere. The door was open into the hall, and poor little tired Sate must have slipped away into the sunshine outside. Well, no harm could come to her there. She would surely wait for them, or, failing in that, the road home was direct enough, and nothing to trouble her. But how strange in little Sate to do it! If it had been Susie, resolute, independent Susie, always sufficient to herself, and a little more ready to do as she pleased than any other way. But Susie sat up prim and dignified on Nettie's right, not very conscious of the music, and willing enough to have the service over, but conscious that she had on her new shoes, and a white dress, and a white bonnet, and looked very well indeed. Meantime, little Sate was not out in the sunshine. She had not thought of sunshine. She had been called. It was not possible for her sweet little heart to get away from the feeling that some one was calling her, and that she wanted to go. What better was there to do than follow the voice? So she followed it, out into the hall, up the gallery stairs, still softly (the new shoes made no sound on the carpet), through the door which stood ajar, quite to the singer's side, there slipped this quiet little woman who had left her white bonnet by Nettie, and stood with her golden head rippling with the sunlight which fell on it. There was a rustle in the choir gallery, a soft stir over the church, the sort of sound which people make when they are moved by some deep feeling which they hardly understand. There was a smile on some faces, but it was a kind of smile which might be given to a baby angel if it had strayed away from heaven to look at something bright down here. The tenor singer would have drawn away the small form from the soloist, but she put forth a protecting hand and circled the child, and sang on, her voice taking sweeter tone, if possible, and dying away in such tenderness as made the smiles on some faces turn to tears, and made the echo linger with them of that last tremulous "Come unto me." But little Sate, when she reached the choir gallery, saw something which startled her out of her sweet resolute calm. Away on the side, up there where few people were, sat her own father, and rolling down his cheeks were tears. Sate had never seen her father cry before. What was the matter? Had she been naughty, and was it making him feel bad? She stole a startled glance at the face of her teacher, whose arm was still around her, and had drawn her toward the seat into which she dropped when the song was over. No, her face was quiet and sweet, not grieved, as Sate was sure it would be if she had been naughty. Neither did the people look cross at her. Many of them had bowed their heads in prayer, but some were sitting erect, looking at her and smiling. Surely she had made no noise. Why should her father cry? She looked at him. He had shaded his face with his hand. Was he crying still? Little Sate thought it over, all in a moment of time, then suddenly she slipped away from the encircling arm, moved softly across the intervening space, into the side gallery, and was at her father's side, with her small hand on his sleeve. He stooped and took her in his arms, and the tears were still in his eyes. But he kissed her, as little Sate had never been kissed before. She nestled in his arms, and felt safe and comforted. The prayer was over, the benediction given, and the worshippers moved down the aisles. Sate rode comfortably in her father's arms, downstairs, out into the hall, outside, in the sunshine, waiting for Nettie and for her white sunbonnet. Presently Nettie came, hurried, flushed, despite her judgment, anxious as to where the bonnetless little girl could have vanished. "Why, Sate," she began, but the rest of the sentence died in astonished silence on her lips, for Sate held her father's hand and looked content. They walked home together, the father and his youngest baby, saying nothing, for Sate was one of those wise-eyed little children who have spells of sweet silence come over them, and Nettie, with Susie, walked behind, the elder sister speculating. Where did little Sate find father? Did he pick her up on the street somewhere, and would he be angry, and not let Nettie take her to church any more? Or did he, passing, spy her in the churchyard and come in for her? Nettie did not know, and Sate did not tell, principally because she did not understand that there was anything to tell. So while the people in their homes talked and laughed about the small white waif who had slipped into the choir, the people in this home were entirely silent about it, and the mother did not know that anything strange had happened. It is true, Susie began to inquire reprovingly, but was hushed by Nettie's warning whisper. Certainly Nettie was gaining a wonderful control over the self-sufficient Susie. The child respected her almost enough to follow her lead unquestioningly, which was a great deal for Susie to do. So they sat together that sweet Sabbath afternoon, Nettie telling her Bible stories and wondering how she should plan. What did Norm intend to do a little later in the day? What was there she could do to keep him from lounging down street? Why was her father staying so long in the choked-up bedroom? What was the matter with her father these days, and how long was anything going to last? Why did she feel, someway, as though she stood on the very edge of something which startled and almost frightened her? Was it because she was afraid her father would not let her take Sate and Susie to church any more? With all these thoughts floating through her mind, it was rather hard to keep herself closely confined to Daniel and his experiences. Suddenly the bedroom door opened and her father came out. Everybody glanced up, though perhaps nobody could have told why. There was a peculiar look on his face. Mrs. Decker noticed it and did not understand it, and felt her heart beat in great thuds against the back of her chair. Little Sate noticed it, and went over to him and slipped her hand inside his. He sat down in the state chair which Nettie and her mother had both contrived to have left vacant, and took Sate in his arms. This of itself was unusual, but after that there was silence, Sate nestling safely in the protective arms and seeming satisfied with all the world. Nettie felt her face flush, and her bosom heave as if the tears were coming, but she could not have told why she wanted to cry. Norm seemed oppressed with the stillness, and broke it by whistling softly. Also he had a small stick and was whittling. It was the only thing he could think of to do just now. It was too early to go out, the boys would not be through with their boarding-house dinners yet. Suddenly Mr. Decker broke in on the almost silence. "Hannah," he said, then he cleared his voice and was still again. "And you children," he added, after a moment, "I've got something to tell you if I knew how. Something that I guess you will be glad to hear. I've turned over a new leaf at last. I've turned it, off and on, in my mind a good many times lately, though I don't know as any of you knew it. I've been thinking about this thing, well, as soon as Nanny there came home, at least. But I haven't understood it very well, and I s'pose I don't now. But I understand it enough to have made up my mind, and that's more than half the battle. The long and short of it is, I have given myself to the Lord, or he has got hold of me somehow. It isn't much of a gift, that's a fact, but the queer thing about it is, he seems to think it worth taking. I told him last night that if he would show a poor stick like me how to do it, why, I'd do my part without fail. And this morning he not only showed the way plain enough, but he sent my little girl to help me along." The father's voice broke then, and a tear trembled in his eye. Sate had held her little head erect, and looked steadily at him as soon as he began to talk, wonder and interest and some sort of still excitement in her face as she listened. At his first pause she broke forth. "Did he mean you, papa, when he said, 'Come unto me'? Was he calling you all the time, and did you tell him you would?" "Yes," he said, bending and kissing the earnest face. "He meant me, and he's been calling me loud this good while, but I never got started till to-day. Now I'm going along with him the rest of the way." "I'm so glad," said little Sate, nestling contentedly back. "I'm so glad, papa. I'm going too." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The New Enterprise. One bright and never to be forgotten day, Nettie and Jerry stood together in the new room, and surveyed with intense satisfaction all its appointments. They were ready to begin business. On that very evening the room was to be open to the public. They looked at each other as they repeated that large-sounding phrase, and laughed gleefully. There had been a great deal to do to get ready. Hours and even days had been spent in planning. It astonished both these young people to discover how many things there were to think of, and get ready for, and guard against, before one could go into business. There was a time when with each new day new perplexities arose. During those days Jerry had spent a good deal of his leisure in fishing, both because at the Smiths and also at the Deckers fish were highly prized, and also because, as he confided to Nettie, a fellow could somehow think a great deal better when his fingers were at work, and when it was still everywhere about him. There were times, however, when his solitude was disturbed. There had been one day in particular when something happened about which he did not tell Nettie. He was in his fishing suit, which though clean and whole was not exactly the style of dress which a boy would wear to a party, and he stood leaning against a rail fence, rod in hand, trying to decide whether he should try his luck on that side, or jump across the logs to a shadier spot, trying also to decide just how they could manage to get another lamp to stand on the reading table, when he heard voices under the trees just back of him. They were whispering in that sort of penetrating whisper that floats so far in the open air, and which some, girls particularly, do not seem to know can be heard a few feet away. Jerry could hear distinctly. In fact, unless he stopped his ears with his hands, he could not help hearing. And the old rule that listeners never hear any good of themselves applied here. "There's that Jerry who lives at the Smiths," said whisperer number 1. "Do look what a fright! I guess he has borrowed a pair of Job Smith's overalls. Isn't it a shame that such a nice-looking boy is deserted in that way, and left to run with all sorts of people?" "I heard that he wasn't deserted, that his father was only staying out West, or down South, or somewhere, for a while." "Oh, that's a likely story," said whisperer number 1, her voice unconsciously growing louder. "Just as if any father who was anybody would leave a boy at Job Smith's for months, and never come near him. I think it is real mean. They say the Smiths keep him at work all the while, fishing. He about supports them, and the Deckers too, with fish and things." At this point the amused listener nearly forgot himself and whistled. "Oh, well, that's as good a way as any to spend his time. He knows enough to catch fish and do such things, and when he is old enough I suppose he will learn a trade. But I must say I think he is a nice-looking fellow." "He would be if he dressed decently. The boys like him real well. They say he is smart, and I shouldn't wonder if he was. His eyes twinkle as though he might be. If he wouldn't keep running with that Decker girl all the time, he might be noticed now and then." At this point came up a third young miss who spoke louder. Jerry recognized her voice at once as belonging to Lorena Barstow. "Girls, what are you doing here? Why, there is that Irish boy. I wonder if he wouldn't sell us some fish. They say he is very anxious to earn money. I should think he would be, to get himself some decent clothes. Or maybe he wants to make his dear Nan a present." Then followed a laugh which was quickly hushed, lest the victim might hear. But the victim had heard, and looked more than amused. His eyes flashed with a new idea. "Much obliged, Miss Lorena," he said softly, nodding his head. "If I don't act on your hint, it will be because I am not so bright as you give me credit for being." Then the first whisperer took up the story. "Say, girls, I heard that Ermina did really mean to invite him to her candy pull, and the Decker girl too. She says they both belong to the Sunday school, and she is going to invite all the boys and girls of that age in the school, and her mother thinks it would not be nice to leave them out. You know the Farleys are real queer about some things." Lorena Barstow flamed into a voice which was almost loud. "Then I say let's just not speak a word to either of them the whole evening. Ermina Farley need not think that because she lives in a grand house, and her father has so much money, she can rule us all. I, for one, don't mean to associate with a drunkard's daughter, and I won't be made to, by the Farleys or anybody else." "Her father isn't a drunkard now. Why, didn't you know he has joined the church? And last Wednesday night they say he was in prayer meeting." "Oh, yes, and what does that amount to? My father says it won't last 6 weeks. He says drunkards are not to be trusted. They never reform. And what if he does? That doesn't make Nan Decker anything but a dowdy, not fit for us girls to go with. And as for that Irish boy, why doesn't Ermina go down on Patty Lane and invite the whole tribe of Irish if she is so fond of them?" "Hush, Lorena, Ermina will hear you." Sure enough, at that moment came Ermina, springing briskly over logs and underbrush. "Have I kept you waiting?" she asked gaily. "The moss was so lovely back there, I wanted to carry the whole of it home to mother. Why, girls, there is that boy who sits across from us in Sabbath school." "How do you do?" she said pleasantly, for at that moment Jerry turned and came toward them, lifting his hat as politely as though it was in the latest shape and style. "Have you had good luck in fishing?" "Very good for this side. The fish are not so plenty here generally as they are further up. I heard you speaking of fish, Miss Barstow, and wondering whether I would not supply your people. I should be very glad to do so occasionally. I am a pretty successful fellow so far as fishing goes." You should have seen the cheeks of the whisperers then. Ermina looked at them, perplexed for a moment, then seeing they answered only with blushes and silence, she spoke. "Mamma would be very glad to get some. She was saying yesterday she wished she knew some one of whom she could get fish as soon as they were caught. Have you some to-day for sale?" "3 beauties which I would like nothing better than to sell, for I am in special need of the money just now." "Very well," said Ermina promptly. "I am sure mamma will like them. Could you carry them down now? I am on my way home, and could show you where to go." "Ermina Farley!" remonstrated Lorena Barstow in a low shocked tone, but Ermina only said, "Good bye, girls, I shall expect you early on Thursday evening," and walked briskly down the path toward the road with Jerry beside her swinging his fish. If the girls could have seen his eyes just then, they would have been sure that they twinkled. They had a pleasant walk, and Ermina did actually invite him to her candy pull on Thursday evening. Not only that, but she asked if he would take an invitation from her to Nettie Decker. "She lives next door to you, I think," said Ermina. "I would like very much to have her come. I think she is so pleasant and unselfish. It is just a few boys and girls of our age, in the Sunday school." How glad Jerry was that she had invited them! He had been so afraid that her courage would not be equal to it. Glad was he also to be able to say, frankly, that both he and Nettie had an engagement for Thursday evening. He would be sure to give Nettie the invitation, but he knew she could not come. Of course she could not, he said to himself. Isn't that our opening evening? But all the same it was very nice in Ermina Farley to have invited them. "Here's another lamp for the table," said Jerry gaily, as he rushed into the new room an hour later and tossed down a shining silver dollar. He had exchanged the fish for it. Then he sat down and told part of their story to Nettie. About the whisperers, however, he kept silent. What was the use in telling that? But from them he had gotten another idea. "Look here, Nettie, some evening we'll have a candy pull, early, with just a few to help, and sell it cheap to customers." So now they stood together in the room to see if there was another thing to be done before the opening. A row of shelves planed and fitted by Norm were ranged 2/3 of the way up the room, and on them were displayed tempting pans of ginger cookies, doughnuts, molasses cookies, and soft gingerbread. Sandwiches made of good bread, and nice slices of ham, were shut into the corner cupboard to keep from drying. There was also a plate of cheese which was a present from Mrs. Smith. She had sent it in with the explanation that it would be a blessing to her if that cheese could get eaten by somebody. She bought it once, a purpose, as a treat for Job, and it seemed it wasn't the kind he liked, and none of the rest of them liked any kind, so there it had stood on the shelf eyeing her for days. There was to be coffee. Nettie had planned for that. "Because," she explained, "they all drink beer, and things to eat can never take the place of things to drink." It had been a difficult matter to get the materials together for this beginning. All the money which came in from the "little old grandmothers," as well as that which Jerry contributed, had been spent in flour and sugar and eggs and milk. Nettie was amazed and dismayed to find how much even soft gingerbread cost, when every pan of it had to be counted in money. A good deal of arithmetic had been spent on the question, how low can we possibly sell this and not actually lose money by it? Of course, some allowance had to be made for waste. "We'll have to name it waste," explained Nettie with an anxious face, "because it won't bring in any money. But of course not a scrap of it will be wasted, but what is left over and gets too dry to sell, we shall have to eat." Jerry shook his head. "We must sell it," he said, with the air of a financier. Then he went away thoughtfully to consult Mrs. Job, and came back triumphant. She would take for a week at half price all the stale cake they might have left. "That means ginger cake," he explained. "She says the cookies and things will keep for weeks without getting too old." "Sure enough," said radiant Nettie. "I did not think of that." There were other things to think of. Some of them greatly perplexed Jerry. He had to catch many fish before they were thought out. Then he came with his views to Nettie. "See here, do you understand about this firm business? It must be you and me, you know?" Nettie's bright face clouded. "Why, I thought," she said, speaking slowly, "I thought you said, or you meant, I thought it was to help Norm, and that he would be a partner." Jerry shook his head. "Can't do it," he said decidedly. "Look here, Nettie, we'll get into trouble right away if we take in a partner. He believes in drinking beer and smoking cigarettes and doing things of that sort. Now if he as a partner introduces anything of the kind, what are we to do?" "Sure enough!" The tone expressed conviction, but not relief. "Then what are we to do, Jerry? I don't see how we are going to help Norm any." "I do, quite as well as though he was a partner. Norm is a good-natured fellow, he likes to help people. I think he likes to do things for others better than for himself. If we explain to him that we want to go into this business, and that you can't wait on customers because you are a girl, and it wouldn't be the thing, and I can't because it is in your house, and I promised my father I would spend my evenings at home and write a piece of a letter to him every evening, and ask him to come to the rescue and keep the room open, and sell the things for us, don't you believe he will be twice as likely to do it as though we made him as young as ourselves and tried to be his equals?" Then Nettie's face was bright. "What a contriver you are!" she said admiringly. "I think that will do just splendidly." She was right, it did. Norm might have curled his lip and said "pooh" to the scheme, had he been placed on an equality; for he was getting to the age when to be considered young or childish is a crime in a boy's eyes. But to be appealed to as one who could help the young fry out of their dilemma, and at the same time provide himself with a very pleasant place to stay, and very congenial employment while he stayed, was quite to Norm's mind. And as it was an affair of the children's, he made no suggestions about beer or cigars. It is true he thought of them, but he thought at once that neither Nettie nor Jerry would probably have anything to do with them, and as he had no dignity to sustain, he decided to not even mention the matter. These two planned really better than they knew in appealing to Norm for help. His curious pride would never have allowed him to say to a boy, "We keep cakes and coffee for sale at our house. Come in and try them." But it was entirely within the line of his ideas of respectability to say, "What do you think those two young ones over at our house have thought up next? They have opened an eating house, cakes and things such as my sister can make, and coffee, dirt cheap. I've promised to run the thing for them in the evening awhile. I suppose you'll patronize them?" And the boys, who would have sneered at his setting himself up in business, answered, "What, the little chap who lives at Smith's? And your little sister? Ho, what a notion! I don't know but it is a bright one, though, as sure as you live. There isn't a spot in this town where a fellow can get a decent bite unless he pays his week's wages for it. Boys, let's go around and see what the little chaps are about." The very first evening was a success. Nettie had assured herself that she must not be disappointed if no one came at first. "You see, it is a new thing," she explained to her mother. "Of course it will take them a little while to get acquainted with it. If nobody at all comes to-night, I shall not be disappointed. Shall you, Jerry?" "Why, yes," said Jerry, "I should, because I know of one boy who is coming, and is going to have a ginger snap and a glass of milk; and that is little Ted Locker, who lives down the lane. They about starved that boy. I shall like to see him get something good. He has 3 cents, and I assured him he could get a brimming glass of milk and a ginger snap for that. He was as delighted as possible." "Poor fellow!" said Nettie. "I mean to tell Norm to let him have 2 snaps, wouldn't you?" And Jerry agreed, not stopping to explain that he had furnished the 3 cents with which Ted was to treat his poor little stomach. So the work began in benevolence. Still Nettie was anxious, not to say nervous. "You will have to eat soft gingerbread at your house for breakfast, dinner, and supper, I am afraid," she said to Jerry with a half laugh, as they stood looking at it. "I don't know why I made 4 tins of it. I seemed to get in a gale when I was making it." "Never you fear," said Jerry, cheerily. "I'll be willing to eat such gingerbread as that 3 times a day for a week. Between you and me," lowering his voice, "Sarah Ann can't make very good gingerbread. When we get such a run of custom that we have none left over to sell, I wish you'd teach her how." I do not know that any member of the 2 households could be said to be more interested in the new enterprise than Mr. Decker. He helped set up the shelves, and he made a little corner shelf on purpose for the lamp, and he watched the entire preparations with an interest which warmed Nettie's heart. I haven't said anything about Mr. Decker during these days, because I found it hard to say. You are acquainted with him as a sour-faced, unreasonable, beer-drinking man; when suddenly he became a man who said "Good morning" when he came into the room, and who sat down smooth-shaven, and with quiet eyes and smile, to his breakfast, and spoke gently to Susie when she tipped her cup of water over, and kissed little Sate when he lifted her to her seat, and waited for Mrs. Decker to bring the coffee-pot, then bowed his head, and in clear tones asked a blessing on the food, how am I to describe him to you? The change was something which even Mrs. Decker, who watched him every minute he was in the house, and thought of him all day long, could not get accustomed to. It astonished her so to think that she, Mrs. Decker, lived in a house where there was a prayer made every night and morning, and where each evening after supper Nettie read a few verses in the Bible, and her father prayed; that every time she passed her own mother's Bible, which had been brought out of its hiding place in an old trunk, she said, under her breath, "Thank the Lord." No, she did not understand it, the marvelous change which had come over her husband. She had known him as a kind man; he had been that when she married him, and for a few months afterwards. She had heard him speak pleasantly to Norm, and show him much attention. He had done it before they were married, and for a while afterwards; but there was a look in his face, and a sound in his voice now, such as she had never seen nor heard before. "It isn't Decker," she said in a burst of confidence to Nettie. "He is just as good as he can be, and I don't know anything in the world he ain't willing to do for me, or for any of us; and it is beautiful, the whole of it. But it is all new. I used to think if the man I married could only come back to me, I should be perfectly happy. But I don't know this man at all. He seems to me sometimes most like an angel." Probably you would have laughed at this. Joe Decker did not look in the least like the picture you have in your mind of an angel. But perhaps if you had known him only a few weeks before, as Mrs. Decker did, and could have seen the wonderful change in him which she saw, the contrast might even have suggested angels. Nettie understood it. She struggled with her timidity and her ignorance of just what ought to be said. Then she made her earnest reply. "Mother, I'll tell you the difference. Father prays, and when people pray, you know, and mean it, as he does, they get to looking very different." But Mrs. Decker did not pray. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Too good to be true. As a matter of fact, there wasn't a cake left, neither doughnut nor ginger snap, hardly a crumb to tell the successful tale. Nettie surveyed the empty shelves the next morning in astonishment. She had been too busy the night before to realize how fast things were going. Naturally, the number and variety of dishes in the Decker household was limited, and the evening to Nettie was a confused murmur of, "Hand us some more cups," "Can't you raise a few more teaspoons somewhere?" "Give us another plate," or "More doughnuts needed," and Nettie flew hither and thither, washed cups, rinsed spoons, said, "What did I do with that towel?" or "Where in the world is the bread knife?" or "Oh, I smell the coffee, maybe it is boiling over," and was conscious of nothing but weariness and relief when the last cup of coffee was drank and the last teaspoon washed. But with the next morning's sunshine, she knew the opening was a success. She counted the gains with eager joy, assuring Jerry that they could have twice as much gingerbread next time. "And you'll need it," said Norm. "I had to tell half a dozen boys that there wasn't a crumb left. I felt sorry for 'em, too. They were boarding house fellows who never get anything decent to eat." Already Norm had apparently forgotten that he was one who used frequently to make a similar complaint. There was a rarely sweet smile on Nettie's face, not born of the chink in the factory bag which she had made for the money. It grew from the thought that she need not hide the bag now, and tremble lest it should be taken to the saloon to pay for whiskey. What a little time ago it was that she had feared that! What a changed world it was! "But there won't be such a crowd again," she said, as they were putting the room in order. "That was the first night." "Humph!" said that wise woman Susie, with a significant toss of her head. "Last night you said we mustn't expect anybody because it was the first night." Then the firm had a hearty laugh at Nettie's expense, and set to work preparing for evening. I am not going to tell you the story of that summer and fall. It was beautiful, as any of the Deckers will tell you with eager eyes and voluble voice if you call on them and start the subject. The business grew and grew, and exceeded their most sanguine expectations. Mr. Decker interested himself in it most heartily, and brought often an old acquaintance to get a cup of coffee. "Make it good and strong," he would say to Nettie in an earnest whisper. "He's thirsty, and I brought him here instead of going for beer. I wish the room was larger, and I'd get others to come." In time, and indeed in a very short space of time, this grew to be the crying need of the firm. "If we only had more room and more dishes!" There was a certain long, low building which had once been used as a boarding house for the factory hands, before that institution grew large and moved into new quarters, and which was not now in use. At this building Jerry and Nettie, and for that matter Norm, looked with longing eyes. They named it "our rooms," and hardly ever passed that they did not suggest some improvement in it which could be easily made, and which would make it just the thing for their business. They knew just what sort of curtains they would have at the windows, just what furnishings in front and back rooms, just how many lamps would be needed. "We will have a hanging lamp over the center table," said Jerry, "one of those new-fashioned things which shine and give a bright light, almost like gas, and lots of books and papers for the boys to read." "But where would we get the books and papers?" would Nettie say with an anxious business face, as though the room and the table and the hanging lamp were arranged for, and the last mentioned articles all that were needed to complete the list. "Oh, they would gather little by little. I know some people who would donate great piles of them if we had a place to put them. For that matter, as it is, father is going to send us some picture papers, a great bundle of them. Send them by express, and we must have a table to put them on." So the plans grew, but constantly they looked at the long, low building and said what a nice place it would be. One morning Jerry came across the yard with a grave face. "What do you think?" he said, the moment he caught sight of Nettie. "They have gone and rented our rooms for a horrid old saloon, whiskey in front and gambling in the back part. Isn't it a shame that they have got ahead of us in just that kind of way?" "Oh, dear me!" said Nettie, drawing out each word to twice its usual length, and sitting down on a corner of the wood box with hands clasped over the dish towel, and for the moment a look on her face as though all was lost. But it was the very same day that Jerry appeared again, his face beaming. This time it was hard to make Nettie hear, for Mrs. Decker was washing, and mingling with the rapid rub-a-dub of the clothes was the sizzle of ham in the spider, and the bubble of a kettle which was bent on boiling over, and making the half-distracted housekeeper all the trouble it could. Yet his news was too good to keep, and he shouted above the din. "I say, Nettie, the man has backed out. Our rooms are not rented after all." "Goody!" said Nettie, and she smiled on the kettle in a way to make it think she did not care if anything in it boiled over on the floor; whereupon it calmed down, of course, and behaved itself. So the weeks passed, and the enterprise grew and flourished. I hope you remember Mrs. Speckle? Very early in the autumn she sent every one of her chicks out into the world to toil for themselves, and began business. Each morning a good-sized, yellow-tinted, warm, beautiful egg lay in the nest waiting for Jerry, and when he came, Mrs. Speckle cackled the news to him in the most interested way. "She couldn't do better if she were a regularly constituted member of the firm, with a share in the profits," said Jerry. The egg was daily carried to Mrs. Farley's, where there was an invalid daughter who had a fancy for that warm, plump egg which came to her each morning, done up daintily in pink cotton and laid in a box just large enough for it. But there came a morning which was a proud one to Nettie. Jerry had returned from Mrs. Farley's with news. "The sick daughter is going South. She has an auntie who is to spend the winter in Florida, so they have decided to send her. They start to-morrow morning. Mrs. Farley said they would take our eggs all the same, and she wished Miss Helen could have them, but somebody else would have to eat them for her." Then Nettie, beaming with pleasure: "Jerry, I wish you would tell Mrs. Farley that we can't spare them any more at present. I would have told you before, but I didn't want to take the egg from Miss Helen. I want to buy them now, every other morning, for mother and father. Mother thinks there is nothing nicer than a fresh egg, and I know father will be pleased." What satisfaction was in Nettie's voice, what joy in her heart! Oh, they were poor, very poor, miserably poor, Lorena Barstow called them, but they had already reached the point where Nettie felt justified in planning for a fresh egg apiece for father and mother, and knew that it could be paid for. So Mrs. Speckle began from that day to keep the results of her industry in the home circle, and grew more important because of that. Almost every day now brought surprises. One of the largest of them was connected with Susie Decker. That young woman, from the very first, had shown a commendable interest in everything pertaining to the business. She patiently did errands for it, in all sorts of weather, and was always ready to dust shelves, arrange cookies without eating so much as a bite, and even wipe teaspoons, a task which she used to think beneath her. "If you can't trust me with things that would smash," she used to say with scornful gravity to Nettie, "then you can't expect me to be willing to wipe those tough spoons." But in these days spoons were taken uncomplainingly. Susie had a business head, and was already learning to count pennies and add them to the 5 and 10 cent pieces; and when Jerry said approvingly, "One of these days she will be our treasurer," the faintest shadow of a blush would appear on Susie's face, but she always went on counting gravely, with an air of one who had not heard a word. On a certain stormy, windy day, one of November's worst, it was discovered late in the afternoon that the molasses jug was empty, and the boys had been promised some molasses candy that very evening. "What shall we do?" asked Nettie, looking perplexed, and standing jug in hand in the middle of the room. "Jerry won't be home in time to get it, and I can't leave those cakes to bake themselves. Mother, you don't think you could see to them a little while I run to the grocery, do you?" Mrs. Decker shook her head, but spoke sympathetically. "I'd do it in a minute, child, or I'd go for the molasses, but these shirts are very particular. I never had such fine ones to iron before, and the irons are just right, and if I should have to leave the bosoms at the wrong minute to look at the cakes, why, it would spoil the bosoms; and on the other hand, if I left the cakes and saved the bosoms, why, they would be spoiled." This seemed logical reasoning. Susie, perched on a high chair in front of the table, was counting a large pile of pennies, putting them in heaps of 25 cents each. She waited until her 4th heap was complete, then looked up. "Why don't you ask me to go?" "Sure enough," said Nettie, laughing. "I'd ask you in a minute if it didn't rain so hard; but it seems a pretty stormy day to send out a little chicken like you." "I'm not a chicken, and I'm not the least bit afraid of rain. I can go as well as not if you only think so." "I don't believe it will hurt her," said Mrs. Decker, glancing doubtfully out at the sullen sky. "It doesn't rain so hard as it did, and she has such a nice thick sack now." It was nice, made of heavy waterproof cloth, with a lovely woolly trimming going all around it. Susie liked that sack almost better than anything else in the world. Her mother had bought it second hand of a woman whose little girl had outgrown it. The mother had washed all day and ironed another day to pay for it, and felt the liveliest delight in seeing Susie in the pretty garment. The rain seemed to be quieting a little, so presently the young woman was robed in sack and waterproof bonnet with a cape, and started on her way. Halfway to the grocery she met Jerry hastening home from school with a bag of books slung across his shoulder. "Is it so late as that?" asked Susie in dismay. "Nettie thought you wouldn't be at home in a good while. The candy won't get done." "No, it is as early as this," he answered, laughing. "We were dismissed an hour earlier than usual this afternoon. Where are you going? After molasses? See here, suppose you give me the jug and you take my books and scud home. There is a big storm coming on. I think the wind is going to blow, and I'm afraid it will twist you all up and pour the molasses over you. Then you'd be ever so sticky." Susie laughed, and exchanged not unwillingly the heavy jug for the books. There had been quite wind enough since she started, and if there was to be more, she had no mind to brave it. "If you hurry," called Jerry, "I think you'll get home before the next squall comes." So she hurried. But Jerry was mistaken. The squall came with all its force, and poor small Susie was twisted and whirled and lost her breath almost, and panted and struggled on, and was only too thankful that she hadn't the molasses jug. Nearly opposite the Farley home, their side door suddenly opened, and a pleasant voice called, "Little girl, come in here, and wait until the shower is over. You will be wet to the skin." It is true, Susie did not believe that her waterproof sack could be wet through, but that dreadful wind so frightened her, twisting the trees as it did, that she was glad to obey the kind voice and rush into shelter. "Why, it is Nettie's sister, I do believe," said Ermina Farley, helping her off with the dripping hood. "You dear little mousie, what sent you out in such a storm?" Miss Susie, not liking the idea of being a mouse much more than she did of being a chicken, answered with dignity and becoming brevity. "Molasses candy!" said Mrs. Farley, laughing, yet with an undertone of disapproval in her voice which keen-minded Susie heard and felt. "I shouldn't think that was a necessity of life on such a day as this." "It is if you have promised it to some boys who don't ever have anything nice, only what they get at our house, and who save their pennies that they spend on beer and cider and cigars to get it." Wise Susie, indignation in every word, yet well controlled, and aware before she finished her sentence that she was deeply interesting her audience. How they questioned her! What was this? Who did it? Who thought of it? When did they begin it? Who came? How did they get the money to buy their things? Susie, thoroughly posted, thoroughly in sympathy with the entire movement, calm, collected, keen far beyond her years, answered clearly and well. Plainly she saw that this lady in a silken gown was interested. "Well, if this isn't a revelation!" said Mrs. Farley at last. "A Young Men's Christian Association not only, but an eating house flourishing right in our midst, and we knowing nothing about it! Did you ever know anything of it, daughter?" "No, ma'am," said Ermina, "but I knew that splendid Nettie was trying to do something for her brother; and that nice boy who used to bring eggs was helping her. It is just like them both. I don't believe there is a nicer girl in town than Nettie Decker." Mrs. Farley seemed unable to give up the subject. She asked many questions as to how long the boys stayed, and what they did all the time. Susie explained. "Well, they eat, you know, and Norm doesn't hurry them. He says they have to pitch the things down fast where they board, to keep them from freezing; and our room is warm because we keep the kitchen door open, and the heat goes in. But we don't know what we shall do when the weather gets real cold. And after they have eaten all the things they can pay for, they look at the pictures. Jerry's father sends him picture papers, and Mr. Sherrill brings some, most every day. Miss Sherrill is coming Thanksgiving night to sing for them, and Nettie says if we only had an organ she would play beautiful music. We want to give them a treat for Thanksgiving. We mean to do it without any pay at all if we can; and father thinks we can because he is working nights this week, and getting extra pay; and Jerry thinks there will be 2 chickens ready, and Nettie wishes we could have an organ for a little while, just for Norm, because he loves music so; but of course we can't." Long before this sentence was finished, Ermina and her mother had exchanged glances, which Susie, being intent on her story, did not see. She was a wise little woman of business. What if Mrs. Farley should say, "Well, I will give you a chicken myself for the Thanksgiving time, and a whole pack of apples?" Then, indeed, Susie believed that her joy would be complete; for Nettie had said, if they could only afford 3 chickens, she believed that with a lot of crust she could make chicken pie enough for them each to have a large piece, hot. Not all the boys, of course, but the 7 or 8 who worked in Norm's shop and boarded at the dreary boarding house. They would so like to give Norm a surprise for his birthday, and have a treat, say at 6 o'clock, for all of these; for this year Thanksgiving fell on Norm's birthday. The storm held up after a little, and Susie, trudging home, a trifle disgusted with Mrs. Farley because she said not a word about a peck of apples or the other chicken, was met by Jerry coming in search of her. The molasses was boiling over, he told her, and so was her mother, with anxiety lest the wind had taken her, Susie, up in a tree, and had forgotten to bring her down again. He hurried her home between the squalls, and Susie quietly resolved to say not a word about all the things she had told at the Farley home. What if Nettie should think she hadn't been womanly to talk so much about what they were doing? If there was one thing that this young woman had a horror of during these days, it was that Nettie would think she was not womanly. The desire, nay, the determination to be so, at all costs, had well nigh cured her of her fits of rage and screaming, because in one of her calm moments Nettie had pointed out to her the fact that she never in her life heard a woman scream like that. Susie, being a logical person, argued the rest of the matter out for herself, and resolved to scream and stamp her foot no more. Great was the astonishment of the Decker family next morning. Mrs. Farley herself came to call on them. She wanted some plain ironing done that afternoon. Yes, Mrs. Decker would do it, and be glad to. It was a leisure afternoon with her. Mrs. Farley wanted something more. She wanted to know about the business in which Nettie and her young friend next door were engaged; and Susie listened breathlessly, for fear it would appear that she had told more than she ought. But Mrs. Farley kept her own counsel, only questioning Nettie closely, and at last she made a proposition that had well nigh been the ruin of the tin of cookies which Nettie was taking from the oven. She dropped the tin. "Did you burn you, child?" asked Mrs. Decker, rushing forward. "No, ma'am," said Nettie, laughing, and trying not to laugh, and wanting to cry, and being too amazed to do so. "But I was so surprised, and so almost scared, that they dropped. Oh, Mrs. Farley, we have wanted that more than anything else in the world. Ever since Mr. Sherrill saw how my brother Norman loved music, and said it might be the saving of him. Jerry and I have planned and planned, but we never thought of being able to do it for a long, long time." Yet all this joy was over an old, somewhat wheezy little house organ, which stood in the second-story unused room of Mrs. Farley's house, and which she had threatened to send to the city auction rooms to get out of the way. She offered to lend it to Nettie for her "rooms," and Nettie's gratitude was so great that the blood seemed inclined to leave her face entirely for a minute, then thought better of it, and rolled over it in waves. Chapter 23 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Crowning Wonder. And they did have the Thanksgiving supper! It seemed wonderful to Nettie, even then, and long afterwards the wonder grew, that so many things occurred about that time to help the scheme along. At first it was to be a very simple little affair. Two of the boys, Rick for instance, and Alf, invited to come in an hour or so before the room was open for the evening, and have a little supper by themselves, a chicken, and possibly some cranberry sauce if she could compass it, though cranberries were very expensive at that season; and besides, they ate sugar in a way which was perfectly alarming. A pie of some sort she had quite set her heart on; but whether it would be pumpkin or not depended on how they succeeded in saving up for extra milk. The circumstances of the Deckers were changing steadily, but when a man was tumbled to the foot of a hill, and lain there quite a while, it is generally a slow process to get up and climb back to where he was before. Mr. Decker's wages were good, and in time he expected to be able to support his family in at least ordinary comfort; but when he came fully to his senses, he stood for a while appalled before the number of things which had been sold to pay his bill at the saloon, and the number of things which in the meantime had worn out, and not been replaced by new ones. Then the rent was 2 months back, and Job Smith had been all that stood between him and a home. There was a great deal to do if the Deckers were to get back to the place from which they began to roll downhill; so extra expenses for cranberries, or even milk, were not to be thought of, if they must be drawn from the family funds. The business of the firm was flourishing, but you must remember that the central feature of the enterprise was to keep prices very low, lower than beer and bad cigars, and the enterprise of the dealers in those things is so great that if you are willing to put up with the meanest sorts you can always get them very low indeed. To compete with them, Jerry and Nettie had to study the most rigid economy to keep their shelves supplied, and even to sometimes "shut their eyes and make a reckless dash at apples or peanuts, regardless of expense." This was the way in which Jerry occasionally apologized for an extra quantity of these luxuries. Still, in the most interesting ways the Thanksgiving supper grew. Mrs. Decker secured within a week of the time an unexpected ironing which she could do in 2 evenings, and she it was who proposed the wild scheme of having 2 chickens and having them hot, and stuffing them with bread crumbs as she used to do years ago, and having gravy and some baked potatoes. She agreed to furnish the extra potatoes and a few turnips, just to make it feel like Thanksgiving. Nettie was astonished but pleased. It would be more work, but what of that? Think of being able to make a real supper for Norm's birthday! Then Mrs. Smith at just the right moment had a present of 2 pumpkins from her country friends. As they could never make away with 2 pumpkins before they would spoil, of course the Deckers must take part of one at least. About that time the minister bought a cow. And what did he do but come himself one night to know if Mrs. Decker had any use for skimmed milk. They were very fond of cream at their house, and skimmed milk gathered faster than they knew what to do with it. "Any use for skim milk!" Mrs. Decker could only repeat the words in a kind of ecstasy at her good luck, and she almost wondered that the yellow pumpkin standing behind the door in the closet did not laugh outright. But the crowning wonder came, after all, on the morning before the eventful day. Jake, the Farleys' man of all work, brought it in a basket, which was large and closely covered, and very heavy looking. It was left at the door with Susie, who went to answer the knock, for Miss Nettie. Susie repeated the name with a lingering tone, as though she liked the sound of the unusual prefix. Then they gathered about the basket. A great solemn-looking turkey with a note in his mouth which said, "A Thanksgiving token for Nettie, from her friend, Ermina Farley." A turkey in the Decker oven! Mr. Decker surveyed the great fellow in silence for a few minutes, then said impressively, "If we don't have a new cook stove before another Thanksgiving Day comes around, my name is not Decker." Mrs. Job Smith left her pies half made, and ran in a friendly way, to see the wonder; and at once remarked that he would exactly fit into their oven, and she wasn't going to cook her turkey till the day afterwards, because they had got to go to Job's uncle's for Thanksgiving. So that matter was settled. It was then that the Deckers decided to make a reckless plunge into society, and invite every boy in Norm's shop to a 3 o'clock dinner, with turkey and cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie and turnip, and all the rest. What a day it was! They grew nearly wild in their efforts to keep all the secrets from Norm, and act as though nothing unusual was happening. Especially was this the case after the morning express brought a package for Nettie from her dear old home, with 2 mince pies, and a box of Auntie Marshall's doughnuts, and a bag of nuts, and as much as 2 pounds of the loveliest candy she ever saw, sent by the young man of the home who was clerk in a wholesale confectioner's. It took Mrs. Decker and Nettie not 5 minutes to resolve, looking curiously into each other's faces the while, to see if they really had become insane, that they would have a regular dessert following the dinner. "It is only once a year," said Nettie apologetically. "It is only once in 5 years," said Mrs. Decker solemnly. "I haven't had a Thanksgiving in 5 years, child, and I never expected to have another." Everybody was busy all day long. Mrs. Smith was in and out, helping as faithfully as though Norm was her boy, and Sarah Ann just gave herself up to the importance of the occasion, and did not go to her uncle's at all. "I can go there any time," she said good-naturedly, "or no time. They always forget that we are alive until Thanksgiving Day, and then they ask us, because they kind of think they've got to. Uncle Jed is a clerk, and his wife makes dresses for the folks on Belmont Street, and they feel stuck up 4 feet above us. I'd rather eat cold pork and potatoes at home than go there any day. I'm dreadful glad of an excuse that father thinks is worth giving." Susie was a young woman of importance that day. Nettie, who had discovered exactly how to manage her, gave her work to do which suited her ideas of what a grown person like herself ought to be about. and when she wanted the table cleared from the picture papers of the night before, instead of telling Miss Susie to fold them away, said, "What do you think, Susie? Would it be best for us to fold these papers away in the closet for to-day, and have this table left clear for the nuts and the candies?" "Yes," said Susie, with her grown-up air, "I think it would. I'll attend to it." And she did it beautifully. "It is well we have no little bits of folks around," said Nettie, when the nuts were being cracked. "They would be tempted to eat some, and then I'm afraid we would not have enough to go around." And Susie, gravely assenting to this theory, arranged the nuts in Mrs. Smith's blue saucers, an equal number of each, and ate not one. Little Sate went with Jerry to give the invitations to the boys, and to charge them to keep the whole thing a profound secret from Norm. They came home by way of the Farley woods, and little Sate appeared at the door with her arms laden with such lovely branches of autumn leaves, that Nettie exclaimed in wild delight, and left her turnips half peeled to help adorn the walls of the front room. This suggested the idea, and by 3 o'clock that room was a bower of beauty. Red and golden and lovely brown leaves mixed in with the evergreen tassels of the pines, with here and there pine cones, and red berries peeping out from everywhere. "You little darling," said Nettie, kissing Sate, "you have made a picture of it, like what they paint on canvas, only 1,000 times lovelier." And Sate, looking on, with her wide sweet eyes aglow with feeling, fitted the picture well. So the feast was spread, and the astonished and hungry boys came and feasted; and Norm, too astonished at first to take it in, began presently to understand that all this preparation and delight were in honor of his birthday; and though he said not a word, aloud, he kept up in his soul a steady line of thought, the center of which was this: "I don't deserve it, that's a fact. There's mother doing everything for me, and Nettie working like a slave, and the children going without things to give me a treat. I'll be in a better fix to keep a birthday before it gets round again, see if I'm not." His was not the only thinking which was done that day. Rick, merry enough all the afternoon, and enjoying his dinner as well as it is possible for a hungry fellow to do, nevertheless had a sober look on his face more than once, and said as he shook hands with Norm that night, "I'll tell you what it is, my boy, if I had your kind of a home and folks, I'd be worth something in the world. I would, so. I ain't sure, between you and me, but I shall anyhow, just for the sake of getting into such Thanksgiving houses once in a while. By and by a fellow will have to carry himself pretty straight, or that sister of yours won't have nothing to do with him. I can see it in her eyes." Then he went home; and cold though his room was, he sat down, even after he had pulled off his coat, as a memory of some thoughtful word of Nettie's came over him, and went all over it again. Then he brought his hand hard down with a thud on the rickety table, on which he leaned, and said, "As sure as you live and breathe the breath of life, old fellow, you've got to turn over a new leaf, and you've got to begin to-night." It was less than a week after the Thanksgiving excitements that the town got itself roused over something which reached even to the children. Jerry came home from school with it, and came directly to Nettie, his cheeks aglow with the news. "There's to be the biggest kind of a time here next Thursday, Nettie. Don't you think General McClintock is coming to give a lecture, and they are going to give him a reception at Judge Bentley's, and I don't know what all, and the schools are all going to dismiss and go down to the train in procession to meet him, and they are going to sing 'Hail to the Chief,' and the band is to play 'See the Conquering Hero Comes,' and I don't know what isn't going to be done." "Who is General McClintock?" said ignorant Nettie, composedly drying her plate as if all the generals in the world were nothing to her. Then did Jerry come the nearest impatience that Nettie had ever seen in him; and he launched forth in such a wild praise of General McClintock, and such an excited account of the things which he had done and said, and prevented, and pushed, that Nettie was half bewildered, and delightfully excited when he paused for breath. Henceforth the talk of the town was General McClintock. "It is a wonder they asked him to speak on temperance," said Nettie, disdain in her voice. She had not a high opinion of the temperance enthusiasm of the town in which she lived. "They didn't," said Jerry. "He asked himself. They wanted him to talk about the war, or the tariff, or the Great West, or some other stupid thing, but he said, 'No, sir, the great question of the day is temperance, and I shall speak on that or nothing.'" "How do you happen to know so much about him?" Nettie questioned one day when Jerry was at his highest pitch of excitement. "Ho!" he said, almost in scorn. "I have known about him ever since I was born. Everybody knows General McClintock." Then Nettie felt meek and ignorant. Nothing had ever so excited Jerry as the coming of a hero; and indeed the town generally seemed to have caught fire. General McClintock seemed to be the theme of every tongue. Connected with these days, Nettie had her perplexities and her sorrows. In the first place, Jerry was obstinately determined that she should join the procession with him to meet General McClintock. In vain she protested that she did not belong to the public schools. He did, he said, and that was enough. Then when Nettie urged and almost cried, he had another plan. "Well, then, we won't go as scholars. We'll go ahead as private individuals. I'm only a kind of a scholar anyhow, just holding on for a few weeks till my father comes. We'll go up there early and get a good place before the procession forms, and see the whole of it. I know the marshal real well. He's a good friend of mine, and I know he will give us a place." It was of no use for Nettie to protest, to remind him that the girls would think she was putting herself forward, to say that she had nothing to wear to such a gathering. She might as well have talked to a stone for all the impression she made. She had never seen him so resolute to have his own way. He did not care what she wore, it made not the slightest difference to him what the girls said, and he did ask it of her as a kindness to him, and he should be hurt so that he could never get over it if she refused to go. He had never wanted anything so much in his life, and he could not give it up. So Nettie, reluctant, sorrowful, promised and cried over it in her room that night. She wanted to please Jerry, for his father was coming now in a few weeks perhaps, and Jerry would go away with him, and she would never see him again. And what in the world would she do without him? And here she cried harder than ever. Then came up that dreadful question of clothes. Her one winter dress was too short and too narrow, and a good deal worn. Auntie Marshall had thought last winter that it would hardly do for a church dress, and here it was still her best. There was no such thing as a new one for the present, for mother had not had anything in so long, she must be clothed, and Nettie was willing to wait. But she was not willing to take a conspicuous place on a public day, and be stared at and talked about. However, Jerry continued merciless to the very last. Nothing else would satisfy him. He hurried her in a breathless state down the hill to the platform, smiled and nodded to his friend the marshal, who nodded back in the most confidential manner, and perched them on the corner of the temporary platform, right behind the reception committee. It was every whit as disagreeable as Nettie had planned that it should be. Of course, Lorena Barstow was among the leaders in the young people's procession, and of course she contrived to get enough to be heard, and to say in a most unnecessarily loud voice, "Do look at that Decker girl perched up there on the platform! If she doesn't contrive to make herself a laughing-stock everywhere! Girls, look at her hat! She must have worn it ever since they came out of the ark! What business is she here, anyway? She doesn't belong to the schools." There was much more in the same vein, much pushing and crowding and laughing and hateful speeches about folks who crowded in where they didn't belong, and poor Nettie, the tears only kept back by force of will, looked in vain for sympathy into Jerry's fairly dancing eyes. What ailed the boy? She had never seen him so almost wild with eager excitement before. Judge Barstow and Dr. Lewis were both on the reception committee, of course, and under cover of this their daughters wedged their way to the front, and whispered to the fathers. Loud whispers. "Papa, that ridiculous Decker girl and the little Irish boy with her ought not to be perched up there in that conspicuous place. She doesn't belong here, anyway. She isn't a scholar." Then Judge Barstow in good-humored tones to Jerry. "My boy, don't you think you would find it quite as pleasant down there among the others? This little girl doesn't want to be up here, I am sure. Suppose you both go down and fall behind the procession. You can see the General when the carriage passes. It is to be thrown open so every one can see." Then the marshal. "If you please, Judge Barstow, it won't do for them to try to get through now. The crowd is so great they might be hurt. There is plenty of room where they stand. They will do no harm." Now the tears must come from the indignant eyes. No, they shall not. Jerry doesn't even wink. He only laughs in the highest good humor. Has Jerry gone wild with excitement? "It will all be over in 2 minutes," explains Judge Barstow. "He wished to drive directly to his hotel, and have perfect quiet for 2 hours. He declined to be entertained at a private house or to say a word at the depot. I suppose he is fatigued, and doesn't like to trust his voice to speak in the open air. So the committee are to shake hands with him as rapidly as possible, and show him to his carriage, and not wait on him for 2 hours. He has ordered a private dinner at the Kepler house." Suddenly there is the whistle of the train. The band plays "See, the Conquering Hero Comes." With the second strain the train comes to a halt, and a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a military air all about him steps from the platform amid the cheers of thousands. Now, indeed, was some excuse for Lorena Barstow's loud exclamations of disapproval. There was Jerry, pushing his way among the throng, holding so firmly all the while to Nettie's hand that escape was impossible. Pushing even past the reception committee, notwithstanding the detaining hand of Judge Barstow, who says, "See here, my boy, you are impudent. Did you know it?" "I beg pardon," says Jerry respectfully, but he slips past him, just as General McClintock with curious words is thanking the committee of reception, declining their pressing personal invitations, his eyes meantime roving over the crowd in search of something or somebody. Suddenly they melt with a tenderness which does not belong to the soldier, and the firm lips quiver as his voice says, "Oh, my boy!" and Jerry the Irish boy flings himself into General McClintock's arms, and the world stands agape. Just a second, and his hand holds firmly to the sack which covers Nettie's startled, frightened form, then he releases himself and turns to her. "Father, this is Nettie." "Sure enough," said the General, and his tall head bends, and the mustached lips of the old soldier touch Nettie's cheek, and the cheering, hushed for a second, breaks forth afresh. It is a moment of the wildest excitement. Even then Nettie tries to break away and is held fast. And an officer of the day advances with the military salute and assures the General that his carriage is in waiting. And the General himself hands the bewildered Nettie in, with a friendly smile and an assuring, "Of course you must go. My boy planned this whole thing 3 months ago, and you and I must carry out his program to the letter." Then Jerry springs like a cat into the carriage, and the scholars sing "Hail to the Chief," and the carriage, drawn by 4 horses, rolls down the road made wide for it by the Home Guard in full uniform, and the General lifts his hat and bows right and left, and smiles on Nettie Decker sitting by his side, and almost devours with his hungry, fatherly eyes her friend, the Irish boy, on the opposite seat. And the scholars almost forget to sing in their great and ever-increasing amazement. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Little Fishers and Their Nets by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Past and Present. Nettie Decker sat by the window of her father's house, looking out into the beautiful world, taking one last look at the flowers and the trees and the lawn, and all the beautiful and familiar things. Saying good-bye to them, for in a brief 2 hours she was to leave them and the old home. She is Nettie Decker still, but you will not be able to say that of her in another hour. She has changed somewhat since you last saw her in her blue gingham dress a trifle faded, or in her brown merino much the worse for time. To-day she is 20 years old, a lovely summer day, and her birthday is to be celebrated by making it her wedding day. The blue gingham has been long gone, so has the brown merino. The dress she wears to-day looks unlike either of them. It is white, all white. She has a suitable dress at last for a gala day. Soft, rich, quiet white silk. Long and full and pure, not a touch of trimming about it anywhere. Not even a flower yet, though she holds one in her hand in doubt whether she will add it to the whiteness. I think it will probably be pushed among the folds of soft lace which lie across her bosom, for that would please little Sate's artist eye, and Nettie likes to please Sate. While she sits there, watching the birds and the flowers, and thinking of the strange sweet past, and the strange sweet present, there pass by almost underneath the window 2 young ladies. Moving slowly, glancing up curiously at the open casement, from which Nettie draws a little back, that she may not be seen. "That is Nettie's room where the window is open," says one of the ladies. "It is a lovely room. I was in it once when the circle met there. It is furnished in blue, with creamy tints on the walls and furniture. I don't think I ever saw a prettier room. Nettie has excellent taste." "Do you say her brother is to be at the wedding?" "Oh, yes, indeed. He came day before yesterday. He is a splendid looking fellow, and smart. They say he is the finest student Yale has had for years. He graduated with the very highest honors, and now he is studying medicine. I heard Dr. Hobart say that he would be an honor to the profession. You ought to hear him play. I thought he would be a musician, he is so fond of music, and really he plays exquisitely on the organ. Last spring when he was home he played in church all day, and I heard ever so many people say they had never heard anything finer in any church." "I don't remember him. Was he in our set?" "Oh, no, he wasn't in any set when you were here. Why, Irene Lewis, you must remember the Deckers. They weren't in any set." "Oh, I remember them, of course. Don't you know what fun we used to make of Nettie? Didn't we call her Nan? I remember she always wore an old blue and white gingham to Sunday school." "That was years ago. She dresses beautifully now, and in exquisite taste. She must make a lovely bride. I would like to get a glimpse of her." "The McClintocks are very rich, I have been told." "Oh, immensely so, and they say General McClintock just idolizes Nettie. I don't wonder at it. She is a perfectly lovely girl." "Seems to me, Lorena, my dear, about the time I left this part of the world you did not think so much of her as you do now. I remember you used to make all sorts of fun of her, and real hateful speeches, as schoolgirls will, you know. I have a distinct recollection of a flower party where she was, and my conscience, I remember, troubled me at the time for saying so many disagreeable things about her that afternoon. But I recollect I comforted myself with the thought that you were much worse than I. You used to lead off in those days, you know." "Oh, I remember. I was a perfect little idiot in those days. Yes, I was disagreeable enough to Nettie Decker. If she hadn't been a real sweet girl, she would never have forgotten it. But I don't believe she ever thinks of it, and really she is so utterly changed, and all the family are, that I hardly ever remember her as the same girl." "What became of that little Irish boy she used to be so fond of? Jerry, his name was?" "Now, Irene Lewis, you don't mean to tell me you have never heard about him. Well, you have been out of the world, sure enough." "I have never heard a word of him from the time I went with Uncle Lawrence out West. Father moved in the spring, you know, so instead of my coming back early in the spring as I expected, I never came until now. What about Jerry? Did he distinguish himself in any way? I always thought him a fine looking boy." "That is too funny that you shouldn't know. Why, the Irish boy, Jerry, as you call him, is the Gerald McClintock whom Nettie Decker is to marry at 12 o'clock to-day." "Gerald McClintock! How can that be? The boy's name was Jerry Mack." "Indeed it wasn't. We were all deceived in that boy. It does seem so strange that you never heard the story. Why, you see, he was General McClintock's son all the time." "Why did he pretend he was somebody else?" "He didn't pretend. Or at least I heard he said he didn't begin it. It seems that Mrs. Smith, the carman's wife, you know, used to live in General McClintock's family before his wife died, and Job Smith lived there as coachman. When they married, General McClintock broke up housekeeping and went South with his family. Then Mrs. McClintock died, and the General and this one boy boarded in New York, and Gerald attended school. In the spring the General was called to California on some important law business. You know he is a celebrated lawyer, and they say his son is going to be even more brilliant than his father. Well, the father had to go, and the boy made him promise that he might spend the summer vacation with Mrs. Smith out here. The McClintocks had been very fond of her and her husband, and trusted them both; so the General agreed to it, thinking he would be back long before the vacation closed. But he was delayed by one thing and another, and the boy coaxed to stay on, and study in the public school here. He was a pupil in Whately Institute at home. Imagine him taking up with our common schools! So he stayed until the 1st of December, and then his father came. Such a time as that was! You see we all knew of General McClintock, of course, and when it was found we could get him to lecture, the people nearly went wild over it. We couldn't understand why we should have such good fortune, when we knew ever so many places, large cities, had been refused; but it was all explained after he came. It was a beautiful day when he came. All the schools were closed, and we formed a procession and marched to the depot, and the band was there, and great crowds. I remember, as though it were yesterday, how astonished we were to see Nettie Decker and that boy in a conspicuous place on the corner of the platform. Nettie had on her old brown merino, and looked so queer and seemed so out of place, that I went and spoke to father about it, and he advised them to go down and join the procession. But it seems the marshal knew what he was about, and objected to their moving. Then the train came, and there was a great excitement, and in the midst of it the General almost took that boy Jerry in his arms, and kissed him. Then he kissed Nettie Decker, and while we stood wondering what on earth it all meant, they all three entered an elegant carriage drawn by 4 horses, and were carried to the Kepler house. They had an elegant private dinner, they three; and in fact all the time the General was here he kept Nettie Decker with him. He treated her more like a daughter than a stranger. I don't think there was ever such an excitement in this town about anything as we had at that time. The circumstances were so peculiar, you know." "But I don't understand it yet. Why did he call himself Jerry Mack? What was his object in deceiving us all?" "He hadn't the slightest intention of doing so. I heard he said such a thought never entered his mind until we began it. It seems when he was a little bit of a fellow he tried to speak his name, Gerald McClintock, and the nearest he could approach to it was Jerry Mack. Of course they thought it was cunning, and it grew to be his pet name; so before they knew it the servants and all his boy friends called him so all the time. When he came here, Mrs. Smith and her husband naturally used the old name. Then somebody, I'm sure I don't know who, started the story that he was an Irish boy working at the Smiths for his board; and it seems he heard of it, and it amused him so much he decided to let people think so if they wanted to. He coaxed the Smiths not to tell who he was, or why he was here; and they so nearly worshipped him, that if he had asked them to say he was a North American Indian, I believe they would have done it. It seems he liked Nettie Decker from the first, and was annoyed because she wasn't invited in our set. But I am sure I don't know how we were to blame. She had nothing to wear, and how were we to know that she was a very smart girl, and real sweet and good? The Deckers were very poor, and Mr. Decker drank, you know, and Norm was sort of a loafer, and we thought they were real low people." "I remember Ermina Farley was friendly with Nettie, and with the boy, too." "Oh, yes, Ermina was always peculiar. She is yet. I have always thought that perhaps Ermina knew something about the McClintocks, but she says she didn't. I heard her say the other day that somebody told her he was an Irish boy whose father had run away and left him, and the Smiths gave him a home out of pity; and she supposed of course it was so, and was sorry for him. Then she always thought he was handsome and smart. Well, so did I must say." "I wonder who started that absurd story about his father deserting him?" "I don't know, I'm sure. Somebody imagined it was so, I suppose, and spoke of it. Such things spread, you know; nobody seems to understand quite how." "Well, as I remember things, Jerry, I shall always call him by that name, I don't believe I could remember to say Mr. McClintock if I should meet him now, as I remember him, he seemed to be as poor as Nettie. He dressed very well, but not as a gentleman's son, and he seemed to be contriving ways to earn little bits of money. Don't you remember that old hen and chickens he bought? And he used to go to the Farleys every morning with a fresh egg for Helen; sold it, you know, for I was there one morning when Mrs. Farley paid him." "I know it. He was always contriving ways to earn money. Why, Irene, don't you remember his selling fish to Ermina Farley that day when we were talking down by the pond? I have always thought he heard more than we imagined he did that day. I don't clearly remember what we said, but I know we were running on about Nettie Decker and about Jerry. I used to sort of dislike them both, because Ermina Farley was always trying to push them forward. I would give something to know exactly what we did say that day. For a while I did not like to meet any of the McClintocks. It always seemed to me as though they were thinking about that time. But they have been perfectly polite and cordial to me, always; and Nettie Decker is a perfect lady. But I know all about the poverty. It seems the boy Jerry had been very fond of giving away money, and books, and all sorts of things to people whom he thought needed them, and his father began to be afraid he would have no knowledge of the value of money, and would give carelessly, you know, just because he felt like it. So the General had a long talk with him, and made an arrangement that while he was gone West, Jerry should have nothing to give away but what he earned. He might earn as much as he liked, or could, and give it all away if he chose, but not a penny besides, and he was not to appeal to his father to help anybody in any way whatever. Of course the father was to pay all his bills for necessary things. They say he paid a splendid price to the Smiths for taking care of him. Poor Mrs. Smith cried when he went away, as though he had been her own child. Well, of course that crippled him, in his pocket money, but they say his father was very much pleased to find how many schemes he had started for earning money. That plan about the business was his from beginning to end, and just see what it has grown to." "What? I don't know. Remember, I only came night before last, and haven't heard anything about the town since the day I left it." "Why, the Norman House, the most elegant hotel in town, is the outgrowth of that enterprise begun in the Deckers' front room. Mr. Decker owns the whole thing now, and manages it splendidly. His wife is a perfect genius, they say, about managing. She oversees the housekeeping herself, and the cooking is perfect, they say. General McClintock was so pleased with the beginning, that he bought that long low building on Smith Street that first time he was here, and fitted it up for Norman and Nettie to run. He carried his son away with him, of course, but they stayed long enough to see the matter fairly under way. The Norman House is managed on the same general principles; strictly temperance, of course. The General is as great a fanatic about that as the Deckers are, and the prices are very low; lower than other first-class houses, while the table is better, and the rooms are beautifully furnished. They say it is because Mrs. Decker is such an excellent manager that they can afford things at such low prices. Then, besides, there is a lunch room for young men, where they can get excellent things for just what they cost. That is a sort of benevolence. General McClintock devotes a certain amount to it each year. And there is a splendid young man in charge of the room. You saw him once. Rick Walker, his name is. He used to be considered a sort of hard boy, but there isn't a more respected young man in town than he. He is bookkeeper at the Norman House, and has the oversight of this home dining room. You ought to go in there, and it is very nicely furnished, and they have flowers, plants, you know, and birds, and a fountain, and pictures on the walls, and for 15 cents you can get an excellent dinner. Everybody likes Rick Walker. They say he has a great influence over the boys in town, almost as great as Norman Decker. He used to be in charge of it all before he went to college." "Still, I shouldn't think the McClintocks would have liked Nettie Decker to be in quite so public a place," interrupted her listener. "Oh, she isn't public. Why, she went to New York to a private school the very next winter after the General came home. She boarded with them. The General's sister came East with him, and was the lady of the house. Then he sent her to Wellesley, you know. Didn't you know that? She graduated at Wellesley a year ago. Yes, the McClintocks educated her, or began it. Her father has done so well that I suppose he hasn't needed their help lately. He is a master builder, you know, and keeps at his business, and owns and manages this hotel besides. Oh, they are well off. You ought to see Mrs. Decker. She is a very pretty woman, and a real lady. They say Nettie and Norman are so proud of her. What was I telling you? Oh, about the room. They have a library connected with it, and a reading room, and everything complete. It is such a nice thing for our young men. A great many wealthy gentlemen contribute to the library. There is a little alcove at the further end of the reading room where they keep cake and lemonade, and nuts and little things of all sorts. They are very cheap, but the boys can't get any cigars there. I'm so glad of that. The Norman House is in very great favor, quite the fashion, and it makes such a difference with the boys who are just beginning to imagine themselves young men, and who want to be manly, to have an elegant place like that frown on all such things. My brother Dick, you remember him? He was a little fellow when you lived here. He went into the Norman House one day and called for a cigar. He was just beginning to smoke, and I suppose he did it because it would sound manly. It was in the spring when Norman was at home on vacation, and it seems he expressed so much astonishment that Dick was quite ashamed. I don't think he has smoked a cigar since. The Deckers seem to be quite a center of interest in town." "Well, they are. They are a sort of exceptional family, some way. Their experience has been so romantic. Mr. Decker has become such a nice man. Deacon Decker, he is, a prominent man in church and everywhere. Oh, do you remember those 2 cunning little girls? I always thought they were sweet. Susie is a perfect lady. She is going with Nettie and her husband to Washington. But little Sate is a beauty. They say she is going to be a poet and an artist, and she looks almost like an angel. General McClintock admires her very much. He says she shall have the finest art teachers in Europe. I never saw a family come up as they did, from nothing, you may say. But then it was all owing to that fortunate accident of being friends with Gerald McClintock, and having the Farleys interested in them. Did I tell you Norman was engaged to Ermina Farley? Oh, yes, they will marry as soon as he graduates from the medical college, and then he will take her abroad and take a postgraduate course in medicine there. I suppose they will take Sate with them then. They say that is the plan. No, I certainly never saw anything like their success in life. Mrs. Smith doesn't believe in luck, you know, nor much in money, though since her Job has a position in the Norman House that pays better than carting, they have built an addition to their house, and, Sarah Ann says, live like folks. She is housekeeper at the Norman House, Mrs. Decker's right-hand woman. Mrs. Smith says the Lord had a great deal to do with the Decker family, that Nettie came home resolved to be faithful to him, and to trust him to save her father and brother, and so he did it, of course. It seems she and Jerry promised each other to work for Norman and the father in every possible way until they were converted. And they did. I must say I think they are real wonderful Christians, all of them. I like to hear Mr. Decker pray better than almost any other man in our meeting; and as for Norman, he leads a meeting beautifully. They say Mr. Sherrill thought at first that he ought to preach, but now he says he is reconciled; there is greater need for Christian physicians than for ministers. Mr. Sherrill has always been great friends with all the Deckers. You remember he was, from the first. Norman studied with him all the time he was managing that first little bit of a restaurant in the square room of the old Decker house. They tore down that house last month to make room for a carriage drive around the back of their new house, and they say Nettie cried when the square room was torn up. She has some of the quaintest furniture; sofas, she calls them, made out of boxes; and a queer old-fashioned hour-glass stand, and a barrel chair, which have been sent on with all her elegant things to New York. She is going to furnish a room for Gerald and her with them. He made them, it seems, when they began that queer scheme. Who would have supposed it could grow as it did? It really seems as though the Lord must have had a good deal to do with it, doesn't it? I tell you, Irene, it is wonderful how many young men they have helped save, those two. It seems a pity sometimes that they could not have told us girls what they were about, and let us help. But then, I don't know as we would have helped if we had understood. I used to be such a perfect little idiot then. Well, it was Nettie Decker got hold of me at last. Norman signed the pledge that night when General McClintock lectured here, and during the winter he was converted. But it was 2 years after that before I made up my mind. I was miserable all that time, too, because I knew I was doing wrong. And I didn't treat Nettie wonderfully well any of the time. But when she came to see me with her eyes shining with tears, and said she had been praying for me ever since that day of the flower party, I just broke down. Oh, Irene, there's the carriage with the bride and groom and Norman and Ermina. Doesn't the bride look lovely? I wish they had had a public wedding, and let us all see her. But they say General McClintock thinks weddings ought to be very private. Never mind, we will see her at the reception next week. But then she won't be Nettie Decker. We shall have to say good-bye to her." And Miss Lorena Barstow stood still in the street, and shaded her eyes from the sunlight to watch the bridal party as the carriage wound around the square, looking her last with tender, loving eyes upon Nettie Decker. End of Chapter 24. End of Little Fishers and Their Nets, by Pansy.